Mark, are you ready for this?
Cheers, dude. Come on.
Are you ready
Let's go.
for this?
Let's go. We are here for you to the best of our ability. And if I don't know an answer to a question, I will just pivot like a politician.
And that's where I come in, and I'll make sure that we get to the heart of your question. So,
just kidding. I might not know the answers to these things. I'll just say I don't know.
We're gonna
and then I'll
keep
throw
going.
it to you.
Okay, and then
you can Google
I'll
it.
Google it. Yeah, and then I'll look it up.
Look it up in the old Google machine,
Look
kids.
it up. Okay, here we go. Let's get some questions going because they are coming in.
All right, good.
Okay, so that song we just sang was about Jesus, and there's this whole movement going on about they're talking about the existence of Jesus like he didn't exist. So
Right.
our whole faith is based on this person Jesus.
Right.
Talk to us about Jesus.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think what the person is probably getting at is this movement that talks about Jesus literally didn't exist as a historical person. It's called the Christ myth, and so the Christian religion, everything we just sang about, everything that we're about as a church, is based on the idea of a non-entity. He never existed, but a group of people got together and they invented Christianity. They invented this person called Jesus after Horus and Dionysus and Mithras and Attis and all these ancient gods that actually predated Jesus, 1,000, 2,000 years before Jesus ever existed. And they say they had all these archetypal things that were true about them, and now the church just got together and created this cosmic Jesus. So most historians, scholars, all scholars worth their salt, basically look at that whole theory and say that it's relegated to the world of footnotes because there's so much historical evidence for Jesus. So there was only so many people writing in the first century. It's not like today where there's 100 books published every week. There was a certain amount of people writing, and so many of them actually talked about Jesus as a historical person. I'm not talking about the gospel narratives where people had this belief in Jesus already and talk about. I'm talking about people outside the Bible, sometimes antagonistic toward Christianity. So Suetonius, you can look up these names: Suetonius, Tacitus, Pliny the Younger, Josephus. Josephus was a Jew who was actually hired by the Roman Empire to write a history for them, and he was doing so, and he actually talks about Jesus. So all these guys, non-biblical guys, are going, Jesus Christ actually existed. He had followers. He died under Pontius Pilate, and his believers said he rose from the dead, and they actually worshiped him as God. All these outside the... So there's literally more evidence for the existence of Jesus in the realm of the writings of antiquity than any other founder of religion, but also most other people, like a bunch of the Caesars, a bunch of the Roman, famous people. Jesus is cited more than they are. So this is not something that historians look at and go, oh, Jesus never existed. Of course he existed.
So you're establishing the fact that Jesus did exist, but there's historical documents, but do they clash with the Bible? Like the Bible says all these things about these miracles,
right,
and he came back to life. Like, is that in also historical documents?
Yes, the claim. So when Josephus says it and Tacitus, they say his believers, his followers believe he rose from the dead. Now, obviously, they're not coming right out and saying, we saw his, or else they'd be Christians. Like, they're not going to be like, he died, 3 days later rose again, told us he was going to do it. Yeah, anyway, moving on.
Right,
like, they'd be like, let's get back. But what they do say is these people really believe it. Mm-hmm. These people claim that this happened, and they're worshiping him as God, and they're doing things that we can't understand the why behind why they're doing it. So the idea that they're taking care of the sick, they're actually the people that the Roman Empire is kicking to the street and not caring about, that have plagues and diseases. The church was the one, and the reason the church wrote down, they said the reason we're doing this is because we're not afraid to die. Why aren't we afraid to die? Because we literally saw this guy rise from the dead.
So clarify that part.
Yeah.
So you're saying there are people that say we recognize that you recognize that Jesus died and rose again. So if they're around that time, how can you miss that fact that Jesus died and rose again? I swear we don't have social media that's like, he's back, here's a picture of him.
Totally. No one knew what was going on. I mean, you have to remember this is one part of the world, a little, a small group of people claiming that they didn't. But then, of course, the claims go out and out and out to the point where Paul in 1 Corinthians 15 is saying that there were 500 witnesses of the resurrection. And then what's great about when scholars look into the Bible itself and they read 1 Corinthians 15 or they read the Gospels, for instance, what they say is when Paul says there was 500 witnesses, most of whom are still alive, that's what he says in 1 Corinthians 15, of the resurrection, his point is go and ask them. You can literally, so what you do if you're creating a religion is you come up with a whole bunch of stuff, but when it happened, everyone's dead. There's no eyewitnesses still alive, because then they can prove it wrong. Then they can be like, no, I lived in that small town, and we used to make our living on pigs. There was never a time a guy walked in and drowned 2,000 pigs. Remember that story in the Gospels where Jesus throws demons. He doesn't drown them himself. He throws demons into a bunch of pigs. They go down a hill and drown. The whole town would have been bankrupt. People go, I actually lived in that town. That never happened. Right. So what you got to do is wait 100 years, wait 200 years, and then go, oh, our founder did a bunch of things, and then no one's around to go, that never happened. Right. The New Testament never would have had legs to move anywhere. So all the way through it, they cite people's names, right. And the point of citing their names is go and ask them. Right. They're actually still around. They're still alive. All right.
Okay, that actually leads into another question that's coming in here about contradictions in the Bible. Can you talk about, is the Bible to be trusted, not just about Jesus, but about all these different stories? Do they contradict?
Yeah, and I got 5 minutes on the clock.
Yeah, sorry, this is a new
just
question.
So you all know.
Sorry, the exact question is, isn't the Bible full of contradictions and been disproven?
That was not my answer. I was just saying.
Great question.
Okay, but 5 minutes on the clock, every question, because I yap too much, so they put me out. So, so contradictions in the Bible, So if you go on different websites, people love to chat about this kind of stuff, and they say, oh, there's a contradiction here, look at this, look at that. So two things to say. First, those contradictions have been explained pretty simply. And secondly, oftentimes people's claims about these contradictions show that they don't know how stories are told, and they're taking a 21st century hermeneutic or filter and they're putting it on texts that aren't living in the 21st century. And so they're trying to make them say things they don't say. But I'll give you a couple examples of this. So if you go on websites that are trying to say the Bible's, full of contradictions, what they'll say is, Matthew tells us there's X amount of angels at the tomb, and John tells us there's another, Matthew says 2 or whatever, and John says 1, or, flip it. Ergo, it's a contradiction. Or don't you know that, Judas, one text says that Judas hung himself. Another text says that his guts were spilt all over a field, and that's how he died. Look, the Bible's full of contradictions. But the reality is, when you read those narratives, what you realize is the gospel writers are trying to tell us stuff. So there's a certain amount of angels. They weren't saying, the one, for instance, that says there was one angel. What he was saying is the one angel spoke. The other one's trying to tell us how many angels were there. The other gospel writer's just saying one of them talked. 1 and 2 aren't a contradiction if I'm honing in and just telling you, look, I'm not telling you how many were there, I'm just saying one spoke. That's not a contradiction. People talk about the idea of Judas hanging himself, and then over time, of course, the branch breaks, he falls on the ground, he decays, and his guts spill all over the field. These things aren't contradictions. They're different ways and different angles of telling the same story. In fact, what a lot of first century historians talk about, especially those who are involved in literature, they say this: Kristen, if you and I were inventing a religion, here's what we would do. Okay, we're going to come up with a plan, and that plan is that this guy, we're going to claim this guy rose from the dead, and we're going to write it down in books. Okay, you're going to write a book called The Gospel of Kristen. I'm going to write a book called The Gospel of Mark, which is going to get confusing because there's another book out there like that. So here's the thing. When we get to the part, which is the linchpin of everything we believe, when you write your story, make sure that you say there was 2 angels, not 1. Okay, because I'm going to put in 2. So how many? 2 or 1? 2 or 1? 2 or 1? You got to go 2. Everybody? 2, 2, 2, 2. Not 1. Idiot. If you say 1, no one's going to believe us. So what historians do is they say, it actually, if these writers were making it up, there would never be any fluidity in any of their stories. But the fact that they're there actually goes to the legitimacy of these documents to say, man, these guys are telling a story just as it happened, and they're not lining everything up and making sure everything's in order. And because these books are written 20, 30 years apart by different people that actually went from a historical lens on literature, it actually makes them more legit.
Okay, I'm going to cut you off there because you only have a minute left. So that's about contradictions, but also the other part of the question was about disproving the Bible. And I think there's a whole talk about like the creation story and like how we talk about Job and Noah and all these people. Like, were they literal people, or was it a figurative thing? Does it contradict against historical writings at that time?
Not that I know of. Most Old Testament scholars that I've read can trace, certainly Abraham back. So Genesis 12, that's
Right.
Genesis 12 onward is locked from a historical standpoint. And then, of course, there's debate. The debate isn't so much, was Noah a historical figure? The debate among scholars is, did it actually happen in that way? And was it a global flood or a local flood and all that kind of stuff? But my understanding, my interpretation is that these people are actual historical people. And stories are then written around them. And we got to understand, the way literature works is, especially the way Hebrew writings work, it's not to take every single detail and press it into a literal 21st century mold and say, well, this is what it means and this is what it means. For instance, when you're in the creation story in Genesis 1 and 2, there's, of course, debate on how long creation took and all of that. But I believe that you can take all the scientific data about timelines of the universe beginning 15 billion years ago and the earth being X amount of billions of years old. You can actually fit that into the Genesis story. Now, there's debate about this, 2 or 3 different views of this, but my belief is, because when you read the word day, day one, he created this day two. That could actually be the Hebrew word for an epoch or an era, not just a 24-hour period.
Okay, perfect. We're going to the next one.
You need a buzzer.
These are coming in, so we got to get to all these. You guys are, keep sending your questions in. Okay, this one's a great one. Why are Christians against everything and no fun? I love it. I love it. We're boring.
Yeah. It's partly true. We should be, as many people have said, the church should be known for what it's for rather than what it's against. And that's our desire as a church, to be for Jesus, to be for, truth, to be for loving and serving and all the things the church is called to do and be through history, rather than, man, you're killing the life of the party here. The other thing is I think we would be the life of the party if we actually followed the one that we follow. So if you read the life of Jesus, Jesus loved to have parties. I literally just finished a manuscript on a book called The Problem of Jesus. And I was almost going to write a full chapter on this, about how much Jesus loves to party. He's always throwing parties, throwing kingdom parties. In fact, when the Pharisees start busting the chops of the disciples and saying they're walking through fields, they're picking corn on the Sabbath, I can't believe them, picking wheat or whatever. Jesus doesn't go, yeah, you guys, you're right. And he gathers them up. He goes, listen, doctrinally, we need to do this. We need to make sure that we're not picking on Sunday, whatever. He actually, and then they wonder, if you read Mark 1, 2, 3, they wonder, why don't your disciples fast? So picture this, Kristen, you've been a Jew for, part of the Jewish thing, it's been thousands of years, and you always fast. And now this movement leader comes, and he's Jewish, he's a rabbi, so there was tons of rabbis walking around back then, and you'd choose which rabbi you were going to follow. So you've chosen a rabbi. And I'm following a rabbi, and because every rabbi has taught me to fast, that's what I do. But I notice you're not fasting. You never fast. You never look like you're fasting. You're never hungry, and you're following this other guy. I come to you and go, what's the deal? You never fast. And Jesus' answer isn't, oh, shoot, you're right. We should start fasting. He goes, you know what? I'm here to party. We're not fasting right now. In fact, we're throwing a party. We're going to eat what we eat. We're going to drink what we drink. We're going to have fun because we're going to celebrate. Kristen, the kingdom of God is among us. It has dawned. This is our job, to bring the kingdom to the world, to shine, to show everybody the kingdom's here. The life-changing, life-transformative power of Jesus and the Spirit are here. They've arrived. They're not in some distant future. They are now. And that's something we should be happy about. That's something we should be telling the world about. We should be celebrating. We should be living our life to the full. Jesus said, I came to give you life and life to the full. Not I came to give you life so you're sitting around like the boringest people in the town, you bunch of Karens walking around making sure you're killing everybody's fun. Hey, everybody. Make sure everything's in order. Complain. This isn't the spirit of Jesus.
Did you just say a bunch of Karens?
Yeah, look up Karen later.
Okay. I think, I'm thinking about the last couple of sermons, and you use this word adventure, which I think is beautiful because, you think of the word adventure, and it's like this beautiful journey.
Right.
And I think it's a great description of the Christian faith. Like, life with God is an adventure. And sometimes we have this stigma of, like, Christianity is this dull thing where it's all calculated and you have all these different things, which is interesting because there's this other question that kind of comes off of this.
Okay.
I think when we think of fun, we think of like you can do whatever you want. You can have sex with whoever you want. So this question is about sex. Isn't no sex outside of marriage outdated? Does the Bible actually say it is wrong?
Is no sex outside of marriage dated?
No sex outside of marriage.
Is it a dated idea? Is it an ancient idea?
Yeah.
Right. Okay. Yeah. Right. Okay.
Yeah.
So, no. I mean, the thing about sex, and here's the thing. I think it's a really honest question because I think there's a lot of people who claim that they don't want to become Christians or open themselves up to any kind of belief in God or the Bible, whatever. And they claim that it's because they're so philosophically smart and they historically are smart or they're dealing with this question that they can. I think for many of us, the thing behind the thing is your sexuality. You don't want to live in the way the Bible describes, which is, look, you get married and then you have sex. Now, once you're married, like, go read Song of Solomon, sweat it out. It's going to be amazing. It's great. And in fact, sociologists tell us that married sex is the best sex because you learn each other. There's a deep level of commitment. There's things going on. And there's actually more sex and better sex in the context of marriage. And you can go read, there's a bunch of data on that. Actually, in my book, The Problem of God, I have a whole chapter on the problem of sex. It's the longest chapter in the book.
Of course it is.
Of course, and in it, there's a bunch of studies that I cite about this. But so yeah, God set it up this way for our good. Mm-hmm. He set it up this way for our flourishing. And so what's interesting about it? So we'll do an experiment for a sec. So. Here's what you got to understand. When you choose not to believe in God for this issue, let's say you're really honest with yourself and you go kind of really deep behind, you go, okay, this is why I don't believe. Or I don't want to believe because I want to live how I want to live and get the pleasure I want to get, whatever. Okay, so people say, well, I don't like Christianity because its view on sexuality is outdated, whatever. Just know that in that moment, you are showing yourself to be a product of your cultural moment. You are showing yourself to disbelieve in Christianity because of what the Western Canadian world in 2020 that you live in and all the temptations and all the stress about this life and all the apps and all that. Grab a plane and fly to Saudi Arabia and go to Saudi Arabia and ask them why they don't believe in Christianity. And they'll tell you, hey man, you know the Bible's view on sexuality? It's pretty loose. It's not really strict enough. It's not conservative enough. But I'll tell you what's tough. The teaching about forgiving your neighbor, or forgiving your enemy, loving your enemy and praying for those who persecute you. I can't believe in Christianity for that. Yeah. Whereas fly back to here, Canada, everyone's like, everyone should love their enemies. Everyone should, hey, you want some more latte? Because in that moment you're showing my doubts are actually a product of the country I live in. Mm-hmm. And the time I live in. So in that moment, you got to say to yourself, I got to be careful, mm-hmm. because are my doubts actually legitimate, or am I just reading the prompter of the culture that I'm living in, telling me what I should believe and disbelieve? And if I'm inside that matrix, are my doubts legitimate or not? How do I step outside the matrix and not be just a product of the culture I live in? And when it comes down to your sexuality, here's what I would say: God is pro-sex. He loves sex. He just wants it in the context of marriage, for your flourishing, for the flourishing of your spouse, and as a symbol to the world. This is what marriage is, according to Ephesians 5. It's a picture to the world of the gospel, the faithfulness of God to his church. That's what Paul talks about in Ephesians 5, that Christ and the bride, and there's this image of Jesus and the church. And when you have a marriage that's close and connected, you're literally reflecting the gospel out to the world, saying, man, I'm going to love the church even though the church screws up, even though the church, lies to me, even though the church isn't perfect. I'm going to still love and pursue and lay my life down for her. And that becomes the image of marriage.
I think the interesting thing about behind the question of sex outside of marriage is you think that, like, when you want to pursue something that's fun, you think it's a product of the culture. Yeah, you think that you can create your own fun, and it's not a trust thinking that God knows best for you.
100%.
Which is, I think...
It says that you're smarter than him.
Totally. Yeah. And so it's funny, there's a follow-up question. Someone just texted in. So how hard can we party, Mark? I love it.
Oh, man. Here's the thing. So here's what the Bible says. Do not get drunk. So getting drunk is a sin. Okay, and most times when I'm doing stuff like this publicly, people ask about drinking and drunkenness. So the Bible's pretty clear. Getting drunk, losing control, because it really is. You're just trying to tap into something else to deal with life or whatever and get happy because they manufacture it synthetically. But getting drunk is wrong. But Jesus at a wedding stood before those 6 stone. We were looking at pictures of me running around Israel the other day, and these big stone water pots full of water that he changed into wine, and that was the end of the party. And there was one scholar who did the calculation on how much water would have been in there, and it would have created 900 bottles of wine. Now, I don't know how many people were at this wedding, but Jesus likes to party.
Jesus likes to party. All right. Well, let's go to another question.
Okay.
Let's go into, so we like to party. This is kind of not really anything. So what do you think about preachers in sneakers? Why do so many pastors flaunt their wealth?
Yeah. So it's a great question. So preachers and sneakers, for those of you who have no idea, do you even know what it is? You're reading it like you have no idea.
Well, because you talked about it before, and it's like an Instagram
you
channel.
have kids,
right?
you're busy.
Yeah. I'm a little
you can go on the
outdated
internet in 15 years and check back in with what's going on.
One
So
day.
preachers and sneakers is this Instagram account that basically takes pictures of preachers and they're wearing really expensive clothing, like $700 pair of shoes, $3,000 jacket, $1,500 t-shirts.
Okay.
And basically they're saying, why are you guys acting? Like, what are you doing,
yeah,
right? Half your congregation can't afford any of this. And so the debate is basically this. The flaunting, the spirit behind the question is this person doesn't like the flaunting of pastors. And I get that. I think we shouldn't be flaunting things. I think we shouldn't be, because a lot of these, and the debate is, well, their congregation basically pays them and then they flaunt what they can't afford in front of them, which technically is not always true. These guys make money elsewhere. They sell books, they speak, they do a whole bunch of stuff, which is how and a lot of them are actually given these clothes and told to wear them on Instagram to sell stuff. So they're actually like a commercial. They're not buying these clothes themselves. Now, I don't think that actually solves the problem because they're still conveying a kind of, so when I'm going to wear, $1,500 Yeezys or something, and then like a $1,000 Gucci shirt, that's down to here, so you see all my chest hair hanging out, whatever, and I'm up preaching, it's like, dude, what are you doing?
Right.
Now everyone in the you're supposed to not make brothers stumble, and money is probably the way people stumble the most.
Yeah.
So you just got to be careful.
Right.
And I think this is what the New Testament would advise: is you're supposed to be showing a life where you're not after money and fame and glamour and whatever. You're supposed, the qualifications of elders in 1 Timothy 3 and Titus chapter 1. Not greedy for gain and so on. So I think you got to be careful. On the other hand, I think we all have to check our own hearts when we judge people from a distance because we don't always know the full story. I'll give you an example. So these shoes I'm wearing right now, okay, these? Okay. So I wore these one day, I think on stage or something.
Okay.
And someone texted somebody and said, I can't believe Mark's wearing, there's a famous shoe, I forget what the company is, I think they're Gucci, that look like this. They have like a bumblebee on the side, and I don't know, or whatever. And they're $1,500 shoes.
Right.
I can't believe Mark, these are Aldo's.
Right.
Okay, I got them for $40.
Right.
So you're judging. Now, I didn't end up on preachers with sneakers, all right? Still trying.
Your Aldo's?
Yeah, still trying, y'all. But you just got to be careful. You got to be constantly looking at your own heart and go, why does this bug me? So I don't have a problem holding people who take Christian leadership on, holding them responsible. I think we should. And we should call it some of this stuff's ridiculous. And the problem with it is it fits into a prosperity gospel mode. So those of you who don't know what the prosperity gospel is, basically saying if you believe in Jesus, your life's going to be great. God's going to give you a bunch of money. He's going to make your life glamorous. He's going to give you health. He's going to bless you, and nothing but blessing in your life. And of course, the undergirding theology of that is, well, when my life falls apart, what does that mean? He's not blessing me anymore. Am I not believing enough? But they have to convey a certain life. And so let's wear a $3,000 this, let's do them, to show everybody that God's blessing me because I'm being faithful. And that's what it starts communicating. And there's the prosperity gospel is one of the fastest growing versions of Christianity. I think it's anti-Christian in many sense, but in the world, because if you go to a third world country and you say, believe in the Bible, but it's not only to go to heaven when you die, because that doesn't solve you and your problems now, but you believe in Jesus, that means as one writer has said, your pigs won't die and your women won't have miscarriages and there'll be clothes on your back and food in your bellies. And they go, oh, I'll take Jesus.
Right.
And the point is, it's not to get Jesus, it's to get the treasure it's gift above giver.
Right.
So what we should be saying is you get God, you get the giver, and people are like, yeah, whatever. I want the gift that the giver gives me. That's what I actually want. I want the thing. And that's what it can communicate.
Yeah, talk
so
about that balance, though. Like, you have 40 seconds left. Talk about that balance of how do you really balance that where I really want this in life, like this practical thing, but then you want God too. Like, how do you navigate that balance?
Well, I think it's Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount. It's the idea of talking about you're going to treasure Jesus, but there's going to be things in your life, but just don't go after the things that rust and moths destroy. Build up treasures in heaven by your life, serving Jesus, serving other people. There's times when you need to take your wealth and distribute it and actually sacrifice it. If God gives you resources, make sure you use them for kingdom things, and build up treasures in heaven versus just the house and the square footage and the flashy boat and whatever. Now, I'm not saying flashy boat means you're evil and blah, blah. I'm saying make sure that you're distributing wealth as well and not hoarding it all.
Okay, let's keep moving because your 5 minutes is up here.
Yeah, you asked to follow up. I had 20 seconds.
I'm sorry. It was interesting. Okay, so another question here, a different direction, is all about this COVID moment. And I think a common question and a topic of conversation right now is about end times and this whole thing about... Yeah, end times. So here we go. This good question. Is COVID part of the end times, or could it be a judgment from God?
Well, I don't necessarily think those things would be different. It could be both. It's okay. I think it's impossible to know the answer to this question in one sense. So there's a couple issues here. First, it's going to be somewhat impossible to be able to trace it to whether it's the end times because, in a sense, yes, the Bible talks about there being pestilence, for instance, in the end, but what does that mean? There's all kinds of diseases all the time. You would have thought you were living in the end times when the Spanish flu killed 40 million people. The year after World War I ended, that killed 20 million people. So you would think, my gosh, we just got 4 years. Oh, is this the end times? 20 million people this time. And then 1918 comes, you're like 40 million people, Spanish flu, dead in the world. Oh my gosh, now it's definitely the end. You would have thought it was the end in World War II when 40 million, whatever, how all these. And now we're looking at this and we're all sitting in our homes for 2 months and we think it's the end times because this many people died. And it's like, okay, everybody, calm down. Everybody thinks their moment is the moment, right? So that's issue number one, is let's just be careful. I believe the world could continue on for another 500,000 years, to be honest. I don't think the Bible gives us specific timelines about this. This is what is called a hermeneutic issue. And what I mean by that is hermeneutics is the art and science of biblical interpretation. How do you interpret a biblical text? And this comes back to that. There are people who take Bible texts, throw them totally out of context, and say, look what this is saying. So they go, I remember when I was in Bible college, this guy was in our little coffee shop. He goes, hey, come upstairs. I want to pray for you guys. So me and my buddy went upstairs, and he started praying for us. And we're like, what? And then he just goes like that. And he goes, boom. And he reads, he's like, Malichi, the son of Bacha, ruler of district of, this is for you. And we're like, what? No, that has nothing to do with us. And he was just taking, so here's what people do. They just go into some random, in a book, so there's different genres in the Bible, right? There's apocalyptic literature is not meant to be read literally. It's it's like reading Lord of the Rings. You're not supposed to read Lord of the Rings like you read the newspaper. These are different things. Well, when you're in apocalyptic literature and it's talking about numbers and people start doing calculations, going, look, this year equals that year, this is 2020. And it's like, numbers are symbolic in apocalyptic literature. They're always symbolic. Everything in those books is symbolic. So randomly going in and going, I know how to read Daniel, and this is about the end times, and this is about coronavirus. It's like, no. So read the text for what it's worth. And here's what you got to understand about the Bible. It can't mean something that it couldn't have meant to the first century. If you're reading the book of Revelation, for instance, it couldn't mean something that those people wouldn't understand because it had a pastoral and theological purpose for them and for us today. But it's not just about you're living in the end times. Every group of people thinks you're living in the end times. And the last thing I'll say about that is it's because we are. And what I mean by that is you go back to Acts chapter 2. the Apostle Peter gets up and he preaches a sermon and he quotes Joel chapter 2 about the sun being darkened and the moon turning to blood and the stars falling from the sky and the Spirit of God dropping on people. And he says, in the last days, and he reads Joel 2, and then he says, this is today. This is now. This is the importance theologically of this historical moment. This is the moon going dark. This is the stars falling. This is apocalyptic literature saying the coming of the Spirit is the birth of a new world, and this is the way Joel talked about it. Well, so in that sense, we've been living in the last times for 2,000 years. And that's why I say, look, Jesus could literally come back tomorrow, or he could come back in 500,000 years. I don't think we can assess every single scenario and go, look, there's a disease that's spreading and we're all nervous. I think what happens is we all go in our house for 2 or 3 months and we're online all day and our brains start going and we start extrapolating out all kinds of ideas that have nothing to do with each other. We throw them all together and we go, look at this. And it's like, look, Martin Luther thought he was living in the last times in the 1500s. All throughout church history, everyone thinks they're living in the last times. So we just got to be very, as Jesus would say, wise as serpents and innocent as doves. There are people that I've hung out with, non-Christian people, who literally look at the church and they go, dude, I can't handle these people. They're whacked. Like, all they do is get online and go, we're living in the end, you know, and it's like, I'm not saying that's necessarily wrong, but everyone, we should be shrewd as serpents, right? This is what Jesus is saying. Be wise in the way you talk about these things. Make sure that you're measured and the Holy Spirit's creating that peace in your life. Don't look like an anxious, paranoid person. That's not the reflection of the church and the world.
Mm-hmm. That's good. You're 5 minutes on the dot.
Doing my best.
So you just talked about end times, and that's the end of the world. Let's talk about the beginning. Doesn't evolution?
Good segue, Kristen. You're getting good at this.
I am a pro at this right now. But it's a question that came in about evolution. Right. Doesn't evolution disprove the Bible or the flood? Doesn't science contradict stories of the Bible?
Yeah. So you're scientists out there, and you believe the general conclusions of evolutionary development and so on. So there are 2 or 3 camps on this. The one camp is, yes, it's definitely a contradiction. And what they say is Adam and Eve are literal people. The world was created in 6 literal days. So there can't be any evolution. There can't be any billions of years ago. There can't be any of that. You know, the earth is 10, 20, 30,000 years old. We know it because of Abraham's genealogy. Everything's literal in the Bible. You should take it. So it's either the Bible or science. No one read the Bible like that before 200 years ago. So you got to understand that, coming back to my earlier point about you don't have to read certain texts, Genesis 1 and 2, as saying the world was created in 24 hours, because you got to understand literally the stars. So what's a day? What's a day? A day is like sun and moon and stars rotate, all of that is a day. All right. So the sun isn't, and the stars aren't made until like day 3 or 4. So how do you have a 24-hour period without there being sun? This is not the point of the story. You're not supposed to get in there and go, look at. Now, from the evolutionary standpoint, there are a lot of Christians, they believe in evolutionary creationism, they call it, or theistic evolution, that say you can combine these 2 ideas and say, this is just kind of a telling of the evolutionary story. And look, God took the dust of the earth in Genesis 2, pre-existing material, and breathed life into it, and ergo, this is kind of the symbolic telling of the whatever. I think there's problems with that. It eliminates Adam and Eve from being historical people, which I think they were. It definitely has some biblical challenges in the sense of, he created this according to its kind. He created this according to its kind, and you don't have an overlap. But I would think that's a legitimate criticism of that view too, is the fossil record. You can read Stephen Meyer on this. He has a book called Darwin's Doubt and the Signature in the Cell and so on. Talks about DNA is better explained through creation versus naturalistic evolution. The fossil record just doesn't show. You would think if there was all these transitional, if the way that you and I got here, which is the story, is like you go from amoeba to reptile, amphibian, and then you go like whale over time becomes a horse, right? Kinds don't stay in their thing. They evolve into other. So if that happened, you'd think when you went into the record, the fossil record, you'd see all these transitional models. Like if your kids ever make you watch the Croods movie? Okay, the Croods movie, you got to.
One.
All right. Well, yeah. Well, it's colorful, Kristen.
Croods, Mom.
What a boring life they're leading. And so they have all these transitional, like half fish, half whatever, right? And it's trying to say, look, we have this story going on in this transitional. The problem is, and Darwin himself said it, he said, the biggest critique against my view is if you can't find these transitional models. And we've been doing archaeology for 200 years since Darwin, and they're not there. The transitional models are literally not there, and so everything is inference. It's like we have, as Stephen Jay Gould said, we have the tips and the nodes of the evolutionary story. Everything else is inference. We actually don't have any evidence and data to get it. It's all extrapolation backwards. And one of the things about this is Darwin was dealing with externals. Like he was doing science where he was like, let's look at this Bible, let's cut it open, let's look at the inside. But now we have DNA. DNA wasn't around. Like we actually can look at the coding of information inside every single cell, every living thing has coded information saying, your hair is going to be this color, your eyes are going to be this color, everything about you is coded. And it's like a literal. So the question is, well, what put it there? Well, naturalism says nothing. Nothing put it there. It's just what it is. And so if you watch the opening scene of Prometheus, a movie I assume you haven't seen.
Nope, I'm not.
Prometheus, there's this opening scene that everyone was confused about. And it's this alien with this big head, and he's like, "Mrr," and he takes like this little thing and he throws it into water, and then water goes down. Everyone's like, we have no idea what that's about. What that is, it's a whole theory, because what the evidence is showing us is that someone created us. We've created, rather than saying it's God, a mind behind this information, we've said, no, it was aliens. So the reason there's DNA, the reason everything seems, in order and a mind created it, because matter doesn't create mind. You have consciousness. You have beauty, you have art, you have morals. Matter can't create that. Something else has to create consciousness. So anyway, all of that to say, they say it was aliens. And we would go, no, don't go that, because then you just got to go where the aliens come from. So let's understand, something begins to exist, has to have a cause. The universe began to exist, ergo the universe had to have a cause, and it makes sense. So
I'm gonna cut you off there because you're at 5 minutes. But you did it in a talk or sermon about evolution, and one of the series. And if you're asking this question, I think it would be really good to go back on our sermon series at thisisvillagechurch.com.
Yeah.
My only thing to this is, like, whoever it is, because it's asked a couple times today or already, is if you're already thinking, like, if you're in this place that you're thinking about evolution, then it's obvious that you're a critical thinker. Like, you're thinking about how the world came to being.
Yeah.
And if you're thinking that way, like when Mark talks about the one or two questions away from the faith, I genuinely believe, like, because the way you think, I feel like you are one question away from the faith, where when you really accept the idea of God as creator, I think just because of the way your mind works, like, it's just going to naturally ripple into everything that you do. And I think that was what happened to you, Mark, is you thought about, like, Christianity, like, where did the world exist?
Right.
And that's how you became a Christian, really. You did the work. And I think we need more Christians in the church that have this critical thought of science and reason. And it was St. Thomas Aquinas who said, the greatest gift God has ever given us is reason. And so I think our job is to find the beautiful balance of the two. So
yeah, they're evidential. I mean, part of how I came to faith was through evidential thinking. I need evidence for everything.
Right.
And so I was like, I'm not just going to believe. Let's look at the history. Let's look at the philosophy. Let's look at the science. Let's look at the literature and try to figure out, is Christianity legitimate? So.
Yeah, it's a great question. Okay, Pastor Mark, do you ever doubt your own faith?
Yes. Yeah, I do. And I think, that's a good, sincere question in the sense of, assuming you do, the person asking it. Yeah, and you know what the cool thing is the Bible never kind of destroys people who have doubts. The kind of paradigmatic person for that is who's been called Doubting Thomas, who, the disciples come to him in John 19, 20, 21 and go, hey, Jesus rose from the dead. And he's like, no, I won't believe that unless I see it with my own, And then Jesus shows up, and when Jesus showed up, he was like, "Hey, what's going on? Why'd you doubt everything?" Whatever. He's like, "Thomas, I could use you." And of course, they say that Thomas was the first disciple to India and brought the gospel there. The Bible doesn't destroy, people who have doubts. I think what's really important is for us to go. In fact, the Bible is to come at it with a spirit that says, "Help my unbelief." So, are you coming at even all these questions, if you're a skeptic, are you coming at it saying, "I doubt the existence of God, help my unbelief," as the disciples said? Or are you coming at it like, "I doubt the existence of God, and I don't want to believe, so I'm just going to look for every reason, and every reason that's given, I'm just going to be cute and funny and smart, and I'm going to go read a couple Reddit comments and then be able to really have an argument against Christians when they, and you're not really coming at it like with a sincere, because when I came at it, there was a sincerity of, okay, there's evidence that's pointing to the existence of God. Morality doesn't make sense without an objective moral law giver. There's a reason you believe rape is wrong, that racism is wrong, and you have to, from a worldview perspective, explain why you believe that. So that's what bugged me, and it bugged C.S. Lewis talked about that. I, as an atheist, what bugged me was I looked at the world and I didn't like how it was, but I was trying to figure out what I was comparing it to. How do I know what the world's supposed to be like? So if you have moral things that bug you, if you have justice things that bug you, all of those are evidences for the existence of God. Because coming back to our question before, if none of that can be explained through a naturalistic evolutionary process. So even if you're a Christian, you believe in evolution and there's debate about how all that works out. You believe that at some point in the process, God took, Cro-Magnon man or whatever and Homo erectus and made him Homo sapien and thinking man. And there was some moment where caveman became an image bearer of God, and that's why they have morality and their thinking and consciousness. There's that kind of process. If you don't have anybody to give you that moral law, and all morality is subjective and it's just you and your experience, well, all of that philosophically breaks down. It doesn't even work. So you've got to, any worldview, Kristen, has to retain the reality of an origin story. What's the origin, meaning, morality, and destiny? If you can't answer those 4 questions from your worldview and all you do is sit around the dinner table and play agnostic, which means I don't know, then I think you're doing a disservice to your own existence. You're doing a disservice to why you're put here on earth. You can't keep pushing the question of God off the table as you're just living your life out under contradictory means. And I refuse to live I didn't want to live in a contradiction. That's just my personality. Right. So I'm either going to go full bore into a contradiction, right, or I've got to actually solve some of these questions. Okay,
I'm going to cut you off because you have 1 minute here. I want to ask you so this person who's asking, if they're dealing with doubt, what's a practical thing that they can do? I guess you're talking about the Bible. What can they do to help with that? Or what would you suggest?
Well, one of the big things is actually read the Bible. So Augustine said the Bible is the face of God for us now. And that's what's going to speak. For me personally, the Bible is where I found God. I would smoke my cigarettes outside my school and just read the Gospels. I was like, wow, this Jesus guy, he's pretty legit. Smoking weed, hanging out with my friends, oh man. It was being confounded, challenged by the person of Jesus in the Gospels that made my life totally change direction. So instead of just sitting around extrapolating about ideas, read the Bible, read Matthew, read Mark, that's the gospel for people in a hurry. Read Mark, read John. And just pray, go, show me Jesus here, and let's see if this person, this historical person, as we were talking about earlier, actually has something to give my life and change me. So I would say that would be the best way to confront this question.
And I think as we're talking, you talk about the Bible a lot, and you made a joke if someone just opened up their Bible and said, this is the verse for you. And I think you talk about different ways. There's poetry and whatnot, apocalyptic words and whatever. If someone is approaching the Bible, what's your best advice of this isn't intimidating? There's so many authors. There's so many things. Is it just as simple as reading it, or do I need extra commentaries?
I would say get a study Bible. So my suggestion would be go out and get an ESV study Bible. It's about that thick, it's probably $80. And it gives you the genre, the introduction to each book. It has commentary all the way down. So what is this verse, this random verse? What does that mean? Oh, it's right here, and it explains it. So that would be my advice to people.
Okay. All right. So we only have time for one more question. Okay, let's end hard. Why does God allow evil? If he is in control, then isn't he the cause of all the bad things in the world?
Yeah, it's a great question. This question is one of the ones that I personally wrestle with the most because, you look around at the brokenness of the world and you go, my goodness, how could there be a loving God? How could there be a God, that's in control? And the first thing is to say this. It's been called the rock of atheism, this question. It's like the thing that's always going to take down theism, which is the belief in God. And there's a few things to say. The first one is there's free will that God has given humankind. And with free will, we do a lot of messed up stuff. Without it, there wouldn't be love, in a sense. And so there was a bit of a cost-benefit ratio that was being calculated at the beginning where God creates humankind who are sentient beings who think through what they do and they're conscious and they're moral creatures who get to make decisions. And how was this going to play out? Well, as Dallas Willard said, if you have a world like that, you create people like that, you're going to probably have a world very similar to ours, which is people who make narcissistic, selfish decisions and kill people and destroy people and step on people in order to get ahead in life and all of that, to become rich and greedy and cheat and all of it. So the second thing, though, is to say, if you're using this as an argument against the existence of God, you have to be very careful because, as I said earlier, the fact that you believe in evil and suffering means that you have a category called evil or suffering. And without God, that category doesn't exist. So for instance, if all we are is the product of naturalistic evolution, meaning unguided evolutionary development over millions of years, then the moral construct you have would have to be the product of that development. But that doesn't make sense because there's so many things you and I believe that according to nature would never hardwire into our brain. That it's almost like you have supernature needing to tell you that certain things are right and wrong because a shark, the way sharks have babies are by raping other sharks. But we don't call it rape. We just call it sharks doing what sharks do, right? When a lion kills a zebra, we don't call it murder. We call it lunch, whatever. So, but we don't, somewhere along the line, we're not zebras, and why? So you have to answer the question where you even got the category called evil. Where did you come up with the idea that when someone goes into a movie theater and shoots up a bunch of people and you go, see, God doesn't exist. Where did you get the idea that shooting up a bunch of people in a movie theater was decisively and objectively wrong? The fact that you have a category to put God on trial means that someone actually gave you the category. Or else, shooting up a bunch of people in the theater, it's just the way nature's red in tooth and claw. It's tough, it's difficult. Moving on. Like, dude, your only thing in life is to protect your family and get your genes into the next generation and survive. Survival of the fittest. It doesn't matter. I got 5 fingers. I will kill anything with 4 because that's my right. But the fact that you don't believe that, the fact that you think you should stand up for people who are oppressed means something else is going on. So, when you look, you've got to at least ask the question, why does this universe bug me the way it is? And that means I know I'm comparing it to something else, something bigger. The other thing is about this is here's the beautiful thing about Christianity. Christianity is not the only thing that needs to answer this question. Every other religion has to answer this question. Atheism's answer is bad. I just talked about it. Well, I don't know. There's no God and we're just animals, whatever. Well, that doesn't work. That's actually contradictory. Eastern philosophy is no good because it's karmic, which means all the suffering that you have in your life, so when I went to India, I got off the airplane and I tried to give money to beggars on the street, women who were sitting there with babies, and they said, don't relieve their suffering. Because if you relieve their suffering, they have to live this back out in the next life because that's them paying karma back. So it's a worldview that actually doesn't deal with suffering. Here's what Christianity does. It says, it doesn't tell you every single scenario of God saying, here's why this happened, here's why this happened. It doesn't answer all those questions. What it does do is says, first, be humble enough to understand that you don't necessarily know what's going on in the universe all the time, which is why ancient philosophical writers never said there's so much evil, and they saw way worse than we do. There's so much evil, ergo God doesn't exist. They said there's so much evil, I must not be able to understand what the gods are doing. There's humility until the Enlightenment. And the Enlightenment came along and we thought our mind is the most important thing, and so we should be able to rationalize. And the last thing is here's what we know. It's not that God doesn't care, because God became a human being in the person and work of Jesus and actually took evil onto himself and dealt with all the pain and agony of the world in order that you might go to a place ultimately where there is no pain and evil anymore through the cross and the resurrection of Jesus. So.
Right. A huge issue that's going on right now is racial injustice. There's protest marches. So the question here, do Christians support the protest around racial injustice? Because many Christian figures seem to have spoken out against it. What is the Christian stance on racism?
Yeah, I mean, there's obviously a few things in there. The racism question is pretty straightforward biblically. God creates humankind in his image. He creates them all shapes, sizes, colors, everything to reflect his glory into the world. And the oppression, suppression, prejudice of any person made in the image of God violates the Bible. It's also a gospel issue because when you read the pictures of heaven, there's these beautiful images of the whole, all the people, all tribe, tongue, nations gathered before the Lamb, singing, all of that before Jesus, Revelation 7, this kind of great. And I remember I was actually, before I moved to Vancouver, I was the pastor, junior high pastor, believe it or not. I did junior high ministry, the all-nighters and all that kind of stuff, which that's why I got out of that ministry, because I understand. But in Toronto, super multicultural. I think there was like 110 different nations represented or something in the church, in the one church. So full of flags and full of just, and it was beautiful. It's like that picture of heaven where every single nation is represented and you're literally doing life together. You're doing worship. And in those moments, the gospel, and actually what we fail to understand is when people want to say, oh, the church shouldn't talk about racism. Like my friends down in the States were talking about this recently. They can preach on adultery. They can preach on greed. They can preach on all these sins. No one gets, they don't get an email. They get up and say racism's wrong, and they go, why are you being political? It's like, this is the furthest thing from political. This is a Bible issue. This is literally, God makes people in his image, not to suppress, not to oppress. And when you read the New Testament, it's oftentimes written to a group of people. Like when you read Romans, when you read Ephesians, when you read Galatians, these books are actually dealing with, as a secondary under gospel issue, a racism issue. Because the issue in the New Testament is there are Jews and there are Gentiles. They've become, Christians, but they don't want to do community together. And so the gospel, the New Testament, half of it is written to almost address racism and go, Jew and Gentile are equal in Christ. You're coming together. You're one community. And Paul calls out Peter in Galatians 2 because Peter was hanging out with all the Gentiles. And then the Jews arrived from Jerusalem, gave him a little pressure, and he left. He broke table fellowship with the Gentiles. And they're like, yeah, you actually, you don't understand the gospel, because the gospel is going to cause you to have table with anybody that believes in Jesus. Anyway, so all that's to know with the protests and stuff. Christianity actually has a history of going against the powers when they're oppressive. So go back and read William Wilberforce, how he's fighting in the House of Commons for the abolition of slavery. Christianity is what drives the abolition of slavery. And so at times you need to protest a thing. You need to, have civil disobedience. At times Christians, certainly when they move Bibles into countries, even till today, a country will say, do you have Bibles? You have a truck of them. You're like, nope. All right. Because you're trying to actually bring the gospel to something that may be illegal or bring attention to something. So protests within Christian history are fine. Of course, the way you protest is obviously an issue. And you want to make sure that you do that. I mean, when you look at Jesus, Here's the guy who literally dies for his enemies, who absorbs evil. He doesn't do evil to other people. That's pretty well a New Testament ethic all the way through. And so making sure you're honoring those in power, like police and all of those things, when they're actually not abusing their power. And so they're amazing people who risk their lives for us every day and got into this job in order to fight for justice and fight against oppressors. And then we kind of all with one broad brush, we say, oh, they're oppressive. On the other hand, we got to make sure that people aren't, whether they're politicians or pastors or whatever role, actually doing that. And sometimes the way to do that is to stand up and go, hey, can I have your attention? We haven't really been heard. We've been living life in a certain way, and we need to get everyone's attention and go, hey, we're actually going to march against this thing. So the Christian ethic would be to do that, but to do it in a way that is, as shrewd as serpents, as Jesus says, and as innocent as doves, holding those two things together to make your statement.
So talk to us a bit, like if the Christian response is that we are supposed to be all one people, why are there often so many churches that are like, this is a Chinese church, this is a black church, this is a Hispanic church?
I think where that comes from, I think Galatians 2 challenges that and doesn't want us to become homogeneous churches. I think why that happens is because very naturally, I was doing an interview with my buddy the other day, who is a minority in Canada. We were talking about his experience. And he said when he first came into the church, him and he would listen to all hip hop music. He came into the church and it was all Coldplay and and it's like, is there anything from my culture that's going to be represented here at all, me and my friend's culture? And he started to feel like there's nothing. And so I think what happens is culturally, a language thing, there becomes this kind of, hey, we don't really do worship like that. I only do that on Sunday. Why is it so different and removed from my cultural expression? And so we end up going to the cultures that we exist within or that we're comfortable in. And so I think that's kind of a natural pilgrimage almost. And so the gospel challenges us to try to make it more eclectic the best we can. So, yeah.
So we're trying.
But I think that's why it happens.
Right, yeah, that makes sense. Okay, we're pivoting to a new question here. This is also asked in the 7 a.m. Why are Christians against everything and no fun?
Yeah, well, we were talking about that. Okay, so Christians, as many people have said throughout history, we want to make sure that we as Christians, as the church, are known for what we're for versus what we're against. We're for the glory of Jesus. We're for serving people. We're for love. We're for all these things. We want to make sure we're known for what we're for versus what we're against, which tends to be what we're at in this cultural moment. We're constantly complaining and nagging everybody in the culture. It's very interesting that take the issue of sexual immorality. For instance, the church gets really jacked up about that, right? Their sexual moors in the culture have derailed. Go read 1 Corinthians 5, where Paul says, why? He goes, I don't want you to be around sexually immoral people, but he goes, I'm not talking about the world, or else you'd have to come out of the world. I'm talking about the church. And so what he's talking about is, why are you expecting the world to act like people who are redeemed in Jesus if they're not? And so John Stott often said this: Jesus gave the image of you are salt and light, right? You are salt and light. Salt of the earth was a preservative. They didn't have fridges, so you'd take meat, you put salt to preserve it, and then light of the world. So John Stott, in his commentary on the Sermon on the Mount, asked this question. He says, if you walk in a room and it's pitch black, do you blame the darkness? If you take a piece of meat and it's just done what it does naturally, which is it's not preserved, you don't whack, bad meat, you bad meat. You ask one question: where's the light? Where's the salt that was supposed to preserve? Where's the light in this room? The room's dark. You don't blame the darkness. And so the church's job is to be a light, not to condemn people who in their world, they don't know Jesus yet. They don't care about the morality that you care about. They're trying to live their life. They haven't had that redeeming moment. So why are you putting a cultural grid on them, or a Christian grid, expecting a culture to act Christian when they're not? Nobody was against the exoskeleton of Christian culture more than Jesus. Read Matthew 23, his most scathing sermon. And in fact, the first time I ever preached, Kristen, the youth pastor said I could preach on any passage, and I preached Matthew 23 because I was angry at all these, because I came in smoking my cigarettes, I had the big baggy pants, I had the chain, the wallet, I'm hanging out. Right. I would literally smoke before the service started, not realizing that the big window was the worship team. And I was like, It was the pastor's office, right?
I love it.
And so all these people were criticizing, oh, we don't like Mark, he doesn't fit them. So the pastor's like, hey, would you like to preach? I'm like, yes, I would. Matthew 23, players. And I just like, you whitewashed tombs, you snakes of vipers, and it was against the Pharisees. Because what's the point of creating a Christian culture where people think they're going to heaven because they're good moral people, and you come to find out they never actually knew Jesus. It was all an exoskeleton. It's a false sense of security when you try to create a Christian culture without creating conversion first.
Right.
And so I think we got to understand that what is the Christian task in this moment? It's to actually be the light of the world, be the salt of the earth, make sure people actually come to know Jesus, and then start talking about these kind of cultural things that come down the way.
And when I think about this question, like whoever's asking, I think the question is a little bit, it's saying, how do we have no fun. And I think the question about fun is like, we think fun is like
Right.
one night stands or like partying, getting drunk or whatever that is. But then the underlying thing is those are just temporary things that'll satisfy you. And you just keep going in rounds of happiness. But what is truly happiness?
Right.
Like, what's the underlying
And Jesus
thing?
loved to have fun.
Right.
Jesus was a partier.
Right.
Jesus loved to say the kingdom of God is among us. When people were criticizing, we talked about this at the earlier service, when people were criticizing his disciples saying they're not fasting, Jesus says, it's not time to fast. I'm here to party. I'm bringing, because the kingdom of God is among us. It is here. We're supposed to be living for the kingdom of God to come. Your will be done. That means party. That means fun. That means being people defined by joy. And the reality is we have a lot of people who are sitting around just like moping going, would you? And here's what they mean by become a Christian. Here, check these doctrinal points off, and that means you're a Christian. Do you believe in the virgin birth? Do you believe Jesus died? Okay, great. Now you're a Christian.
Right.
And it's like, dude, well, tell your face that you're a Christian. Because you're not very happy, and no one's going to be pulled into the gravity force that is the personal work of Jesus with you sitting around, as I talked about earlier, acting like a Karen to everybody. Just, hey, everybody, stop having fun. Let's make sure. This is what Jesus had, the spirit of a prophet who said the kingdom is among us, let's go.
What is that stat you said a few weeks ago? McLean's put out a study that people are so uncomfortable around Christians. It's like 35% of people are uncomfortable around Christians, the same amount as,
drug dealers and pedophiles or something.
Like,
Because
they look at
evangelical Christians and go, these guys are, there's something in their eyes where they're a little shifty.
Right.
They seem to be relating to me with a bit of a different motive, and then they have images of us like hoarding money and all the I need, there's the guys out there like, I need a private jet, which is very true. And if you want to help me out there, just email mark@thisvillagechurch.com. Ding. But the reality is they're going, I need a private jet. Well, why? Because on my commercial airline that I went on, I'm trying to preach, and there's so much sin going on in that airplane.
Yeah.
How dare I try to preach God's word getting off a commercial airline? I need the purity of a private jet. And people are like, oh, take my check for the month.
Oh my goodness.
Preacher here. So I think people are uncomfortable around us because they've come through a culture and that and gone, these guys are whacked.
Right, yeah. And hopefully we're regular
and
people.
Hopefully that's not true.
I mean, we have fun. I mean, we're regular people. Okay, next question. Is it okay to take CBD, just not smoke weed? Oh, you just talked about weed. This is the perfect segue, whoever asked this question.
Yeah, I think if the question is medical marijuana, I think that could be a thing. We did a whole sermon on this. But anything, here's the biblical principle. We take medicine all the time. I just took 2 Advil and a Claritin, so who knows where this is going to go. But in order for we take stuff when we get surgery, we get, we need to take pain meds. As my Old Testament prof way back in the day, Dr. Wiper, he said, people who are against taking medicine, when God did surgery on Adam, at least he put him asleep first before he took his rib out. The idea of this stuff's just normal in life. Right? You got to take drugs, so we got to understand that. So if CBD is that, remember, where it crosses the line, and I know people who have taken it in order to, take away the nausea during chemotherapy and all that kind of stuff. I personally think that this stuff's okay. It's when it crosses the line to make you high that it becomes the question, because the biblical principle in Ephesians 5 is do not get drunk on wine, do not get high on anything, because what you're doing in that moment, and this is very important for our culture, because our culture, that when it hurts, when it's in pain, when it's suffering, it looks for take your drug of choice. Some of you shop, some of you, go around sleep with people, whatever. A lot of people go to alcohol. If you talk to police officers, they tell you that alcohol is the bigger gateway drug to other things that can destroy lives. They're like, oftentimes I'll take a guy who just smoked weed in his house versus a guy who's hammered drunk, yelling and screaming at his family. The guy who's got the weed, he's like, what's up, whatever. Yeah. The alcohol guy is off the chain. So there's actual things that people do. The issue is the drunkenness when it comes to alcohol and making sure you're not getting drunk, because what you're doing, he says, drunk and wine, be filled with the Holy Spirit. When you're looking for joy, when you're looking satisfaction, when you're looking for contentment, don't find it in those things, because you'll never find the joy of the Spirit if you satisfy them with them. And we're always supposed to have a mind that is sharp and a whole posture that is sharp in regard to the world. And what alcohol and drugs do is it just deadens all of that. And so God doesn't want you getting synthetic moments of emotional high. He wants you pining after the Holy Spirit, Jesus, in order to get those things in your life.
So I think you talk about this, and it's a nice theory and it's a nice concept, but for the person asking, or the people asking, it's a question of I'm in the moment. I'm used to going to things like marijuana. I'm used to going to alcohol things. So when you're in the moment, how could you really say Jesus is better? How can you really say something is better than this when I know this will fix my temporary situation?
It will, in many ways, it sometimes does fix your temporary situation, but just because something fixes your temporary situation doesn't mean it's the best play. There's lots of things I could rob a bank, it fixes my temporary situation. It's not a good scenario in life to build my life on. So there's things, of course, things are going to help you fix temporary situations. But the long game becomes destroyed. In fact, I was reading Malcolm Gladwell on this recently, and he was talking about the idea of sometimes what these things do to us is it's not, oftentimes people talk about alcohol as if it's it's the truth serum, right? So it just opens you up to tell people what you really think. But he says not really that. It's not that. It's more myopic, meaning it makes you focus on the moment and forget about the long-term implications of what you're doing. And that's similar to what drugs does at times too. And so you don't want to look at these things as things that are deadening you, as things putting you into a different state. And I can say for people who are like, yeah, but I just smoke weed like I drink. I'm not really sure. I mean, I understand that, but I know when I was smoking weed, every time I smoked weed, I got high. It wasn't I smoked 8 joints and it was the same of having half a beer and I didn't feel anything. It's it was doing something to my state of conscious mind, and that something is the thing the Bible's against. So from a Christian perspective, it would be against it.
So talk to us about that. You were in that. So how did you move from that place practically into a place where I don't need this anymore?
Well, I mean, there's a whole bunch of scenarios, but the main theological point is met Jesus, realized there was greater purpose to life than this. And I had to start thinking bigger than this moment or that moment or whatever. And I started applying that right across the board. I can't just go around and, do whatever I want sexually. I can't just go around and do whatever I want drug-wise. This stuff isn't going to be good for the long game. And so having Jesus actually give me purpose and meaning and direction in my life on the day-to-day, reading through the scriptures. I mean, when I first became a Christian, I was like, okay, sit there smoking my cigarettes, reading the Bible. I'm like, my gosh, Jesus, he's calling me to crazy things. This is amazing. And I'm actually meeting the person of Jesus and the God of the universe through the power of the Bible. And I would say, do that. Don't just listen to us and go to church and sit and watch 5 church services a week. Read the Bible, read Mark, read John, meet the God. Augustine said, the Bible is the face of God for us now. And I think people actually need to give it a shot because their life will be transformed. That's how it happened with me.
Okay. Thank you. Okay, 5 minutes is up. We're going to go to our next one. It just came in. You're saying, Mark, that it's okay for medicine, but are vaccines okay for Christians?
Who let Kristen?
Sorry. You get 33.
All right.
30 seconds on the clock.
I only have 5 minutes to answer the vaccine question.
We're giving
Let's
to
get
you.
Some stats,
we're
kids.
grilling this.
And we're heading to a commercial break. We'll be back.
This is the point of Hot Seat
that's not
Sunday.
a thing? Okay. No, I'm just kidding. Okay, I'll just speak to this. So I know, and I spoke about this a few weeks ago, so let me just talk about this for a second. What is the job of a pastor in a moment like this where you have this cultural question on the table about vaccines? And I have gotten emails, as I said in that sermon a few weeks ago, from both sides of this issue. On the one hand, telling me that I need to be the spokesperson for vaccines because that's going to clear up our culture and that's the way to love your neighbor. And Mark, you need to lead us and make sure everybody gets their vaccines because as a doctor and as a this and a nurse working in it, I don't want to see the destruction of culture, so you got to do this. Next email is, Mark, you need to get up and lead our church and tell us not to ever get a vaccine because it's made like this and it's doing this and this person wants our DNA and everything's. And so here's the thing. What is my role in that? It's to point out that both those worlds exist, and there's a lot of data on both sides of those worlds to go and research. So let's take our big theme of the day, shrewd as serpents. This is Jesus to the disciples. Here's how I want you to function in the world. I want you to be as shrewd as serpents, which means wise and smart. What does that mean? It means you don't believe on both sides of this issue. Everything you read on Facebook ain't true, right? You got to be shrewd. You got to actually research, talk to the people. Listen, Kristen, I'm blown away by how many epidemiologists go to our church. According to Facebook, everybody's an epidemiologist all of a sudden. And now everybody's a race and a civil rights lawyer and everybody knows exactly everything about race. People have opinions about stuff and download them without doing research and saying, on both sides of this issue. We need to be shrewd as serpents, do the research, actually look into stuff, and then as innocent as doves, meaning we have to be pure and righteous in the way that we deal with this. And here's what I mean by that. According to Romans 14, Paul says, there's a debate in the church. I eat vegetables, I don't eat vegetables. He goes, why are you getting judgmental about this guy? Everyone chill. Veggies is not a gospel issue. So he says, make sure you don't do something that makes your brother stumble. That's the hermeneutic, that's the ethic, that's the principle. And live together in community. And I think this is a moment for Village Church and the church across the world where we're going to be tempted to be divisive over this issue. We're going to be tempted to take a secondary, thirdary, fourthary issue, whether you got a vaccine or not, and we're going to create something that's like, this is the definition of whether you're a Christian. And Paul says, be very careful. Veggie eater, non-veggie eater, doesn't matter. We're in the kingdom together. Make sure you prioritize the true thing, which is the gospel. So what is my job then? To get up and take a side or to preach the gospel and make sure my church is not creating disunity by their attitudes on either side of this issue. So I think that's where the church needs to be on this.
I think even you're saying this is a theme of today, shrewd as serpents. I think that's a huge topic for our church. I think so often we take ideas and we don't really know the deeper roots of what we're saying. We know theology. We think we know theology and we think we know, Jesus died and rose again, but have we taken the time to research it, which I think is a huge thing that a lot of Christians don't do to critically think about life or what they're saying, really. So I think that's good.
And I think that's true on both sides of this. I don't think you should just go along with whatever, on the one hand, whatever the government says all the time, every piece of data. I mean, obviously rules and laws. But then I don't think you should believe every website and every idea that seems to counter that either, as if every time the government talks, it's wrong either. I think we need to you take Christians in the first century living in the Roman Empire, read the New Testament, read the book of Acts. On the one hand, they're saying, make sure that you're paying attention to Rome. Give to Caesar that which is Caesar and give to God that. Pay taxes, be good citizens, pay attention. On the other hand, book of Acts, they come in, they say, Peter, you can't preach like this. He's like, what do you mean? You can't preach the gospel. Okay. Throw him in jail. He comes out. They're like, so make sure you don't preach the gospel. Literally next verse is like, okay, cool. Anyways, so Jesus is Lord. And they're like, dude, what are we just going to keep putting you in jail? And so there's that tension that we have to use wisdom and be led by the Spirit, but we can't in this moment, guys. There's going to be so many issues that are going to create the opportunity for division, and judgment within the church. We've got to be so careful not to do that. Make sure the gospel and the Bible's the high priority. Everything else is an in-house conversation, a discussion, a nuanced thing among brothers and sisters. You might agree with this. Great, love you. We disagree.
Okay, I think that's a good transition to this next question because it is a heated topic or a more topic that we're talking about these days. Does the Bible say that gay and transgender people automatically go to hell?
Yeah. So obviously, it's a personal question for a lot of people, as it goes through, it hits on sexuality and all the conversation that's been going on in the last few decades in the context of the church. So I think, firstly, the short answer to that question is no. Hell is not a result of being gay. That's really important. So the thing is so I don't get to make up my own worldview. As a Christian, I don't get to even just take cultural cues from whatever the cultural moment happens to say about anything, any political issue, any sexual issue, anything. I actually have to go back and live under the authority of a different narrative, which is the Bible. So I don't really get to pick and choose when I say this or that. It's an authoritative meta-narrative over my life that I submit to and say, I'm going to believe what the Bible says about this, this, and this, even if it causes some friction with the culture I happen to be living in at the moment. And that's important. And the reason I say that is because, as I shared with a different question at the 7 o'clock, what you want to make sure of is that your question or the thing you don't like about Christianity isn't just a product of your cultural moment and you happen to be just reading the teleprompter of the culture that you're in. And my example of that is this. To one culture, like our culture in the Western world today, a big reason people would reject Christianity is its sexual ethic. And so they would say, you know what, I want to sleep with whoever I want. Christianity's so conservative on this issue, you know, man, woman, context of marriage, man, I want to be able to get on Bumble or Tinder or whatever's out there and do my thing. So I don't want to. And then they say, but you know what we really love? We love about Jesus when we read the Gospels, when he says you got to love your enemy and pray for those who persecute you. That's so great. So we sit around Starbucks, drink our lattes, take our philosophy classes, and we love that. So we love this, we leave that. The problem is you take a plane and you go to Iran and you ask them what they like and dislike about Jesus. When they look at the sexual ethic of the New Testament, they go, you know, that's a little loose. A little loosey-goosey with the sex thing. Like sex, we need to be conservative, traditional, blah, blah. But love your enemies, pray for those who persecute you. No, I reject Jesus based on that. I don't like that. That's too hard. So what reason are you rejecting? What reason are you using to reject Jesus? So I think it's really important that you know your cultural moment. Am I just being a product of my cultural moment in this doubt? And how do I make sure that I'm not just doing that and this thing actually is a thing and a reason to doubt? All that to say, the Bible gives us this clear picture a bunch of times where homosexuality is a sin, talks about that. But what we got to understand, it's also in lists of other sins. And so as Christians, we tend to, like I said, you're expecting the world to act a certain way. Paul tells you not to do that. He tells you how you just go out of the world if you expect everybody to act like you and live like you. And then it's also in a list of people, like in the same list, Romans 1 that people cite that talks about this. It also says being disobedient to your parents is a sin. Right. That lusting, greed, any kind of bad attitude, pride, all of these things are sin. So you're literally in the same category. So Christianity cuts everybody off in the knees and makes everybody is on the same level at the foot of the cross. And then the other thing is, Timothy Keller, I remember him saying one time, you don't go to hell, to answer this question, because you're gay. He said, there's a lot of people who are straight, married, good people sitting at First Baptist Church, Louisiana, who are going to hell. And the reason is you go to hell because you don't know Jesus, period. That's the question. So if you and I were sitting down and you had same-sex attraction or were gay and you wanted to go, okay, Mark, let's sit down, let's go to the pub tonight, let's talk about Christianity. My initial question is not, so who are you sleeping with? We'll get there. Let's talk about Jesus right now. Let's talk about faith. Let's talk about God. Let's talk about the Bible. And these questions, I know there's such a core makeup to us, so we jump right to it. But I'm just saying in the spirit of the conversation, let's get to that. Right. We don't want to put the cart before the horse and say, this is the only issue, because that's not the way Jesus dealt with people.
Totally. Honestly, when I think about this topic, like it is such like a topic that we talk about, and it honestly, it breaks my heart to think about the church and like just the past that we've had of like how we escalate this topic to be such a thing, and the accusations that we've made, the church has things that we've done, and honestly, like what it makes me think of is like the church is for broken people. Like we are all so broken, and even I think there's a stigma to Christians where we go to church and you put on your best clothes and you look a certain way, and there's a stigma that if you go to church you've arrived, or like you're the end all be all, you're going to heaven because you're perfect. And even what you're saying, like all people who go to church don't go to heaven. And so I think it's an interesting thing. Like we're sitting here and we're broken. Like you say often, like we're broken, and I think the people who go to church like are really more in need of God or of a savior than anybody. A follow-up question that just came in is, if I am gay, will I be welcomed and accepted into your church?
Yes. Of course, in the same way that I sin every day. And the church, if you read Eugene Peterson, he just passed away a year or so ago. He's this great writer. He wrote the Bible. He wrote the Message version of the Bible. If you read that, the translation. I remember he wrote in the introduction, I think it's the book of James, he says, this book was written to people who were getting haughty and proud and arrogant about their Christian status. And we have to remember the church is not a country club, it's a hospital. And I think, Village Church's heart is every single person is on a journey toward God in different ways, and we're doing it together. And that's the whole heart of why we ever started a church. It's, and so yes.
It's kind of along the same lines. It's another question, but why is Christianity so exclusive? Why should I choose a God who doesn't choose everybody? It's a great question. So exclusivity. So one of the big kind of philosophies of postmodernism and Canadian nicety kind of religion and worldview today is, you can have your truth, and I'll have my truth, but let's not ruin kind of Christmas dinner by claiming your truth is better than my truth. We all have our truths is kind of a popular, it's true for you, but not for me. Right. And so Christianity comes along and says this interesting thing. It is only through me that you get to the Father. That in Acts chapter 4, Peter gets up and says, Jesus is the only name under heaven by which people can be saved. And people say, that's so judgmental, that's so exclusivistic. But the reality is this: truth is by its very nature exclusive. Okay, so if I was to say to you right now, I'm wearing green socks, and then in 10 minutes from now I said to you I'm wearing blue socks, one of those statements is true, or neither of them are true, but they can't both be true at the same time. And so what philosophers call this is, they say it's the mistake of what's called metaphysical pluralism. It's basically this: we live in a pluralistic culture. So you and I are Christians who are living beside people of all religions, all races. We're doing life together, and we would fight for their right to believe whatever they want to believe, to worship however we want to do that. And I will march with that. I will make sure, I will fight for my fellow people to believe what they want and have the freedom to do that. So that's pluralism. We live in a culture where we're culturally pluralistic. We have different foods and ethnicities. The difference is a metaphysical pluralism. Metaphysics is the study of basically what's true after physics. The word meta means after physics. So after the physical, the God question. When you dip into that, here's the mistake you make. You go from everyone has the right to believe what they want, which is true. You dip into, and they're right in believing it. And that's the problem, because it's just not true. Some people believe false things. And unless we say that's actually historically wrong, not just, I don't want to offend you because you believe that thing, and so let's just all hang out and pretend there's people who think we haven't landed on the moon, Kristen. So what are we going to pretend, because to not ruin Christmas dinner with crazy Uncle Joe, that we just go, yep, nope, no one's landed on the moon, Joe, and we just continue on? Right.
No, life is about the search for what is true, not in what is convenient. And so what we want to do is go, what's actually true historically? Well, you believe Jesus rose from the dead. I believe that there's a pantheon of different gods. Oh, what do you believe? Oh, I believe that, the Bible. Okay, well, we're all true. No. Either all of us are wrong or one of us is right, but it can't be that we're all right at the same time. And so the reality is Christianity by its very nature is exclusive in that it says Jesus is the only way. That may be the most offensive thing to a Canadian culture, at least, because you're saying he's the only way. But literally, that's the way the gospel says it. There's truth and there's falsity, and we can't pretend just to get through life that everyone's right. Not everybody's right. And we already know this because to people when I talk, they say, well, all religions are true. It's like, what about the religions that sacrifice children? Well, no, not that one. Okay, what about that cult under Jim Jones that made 900 people die in a single day by drinking juice? What about that? Well, no, that one's not. So now which ones? The white collar ones, the ones you're comfortable with? No, we've got to get to the point where we go, no, there's actual truth. This is what epistemology is. How did I come to know anything? It's under the assumption that there is truth and the world is not a facade. It's not fake, it's real. And so, anyways, I talk about this in the problem of God. I have a whole chapter dedicated to this, and I'll end with this. When I've had this dialogue with people, they say, "Yeah, but don't you know?" And this is the classic kind of philosophical: the elephant with the four blind guys. Have you ever heard that? Four blind guys are touching an elephant, and the question is, "What are you touching?" And the one guy says, "I'm touching a tree stump," because he's holding the leg, and another guy goes, "I'm touching a hose," because he's holding the nose, and another guy's touching the tail. I'm holding a broom. And people say, see, this is all of us. We're just trying to find God, and this is all of our different interpretations. But the problem, as Leslie Newbigin and other philosophers have pointed out, Alvin Plantinga, is that you're telling that story from the perspective of someone who actually knows. So it doesn't work. You're not actually in the matrix. You're telling the story from outside, but going, look, it's an elephant. Well, how do you know that? And so the question, saying we're all just trying to interpret something, it cuts its legs off by basically saying there is truth to know. And so the reality is different interpretations, sure, people are going to tweak this and tweak that, but let's not say that everyone's right in doing so. Let's just say, let's make sure we're fighting for their right to believe it, but let's actually around the dinner table say, what's actually true? Because this matters to life.
Right.
Actually knowing truth about the way the world works,
right.
The way science works, the way history works, actually matters to life and the way we live it.
So don't just fake it.
Yeah.
All right. Next question's coming in. Why do bad things happen to good people?
Yeah, I mean, this question, why do bad things happen to good people? So there's different ways people have approached this question. I mean, in some sense, it's similar to the question at the earlier service that we talked about evil and suffering, because really the question is assuming a few things. They're assuming people are good, which is, I think I understand the question, but just as a quick little preamble, I think the Western culture assumes something about people, where we look at people and we assume a basic goodness about them. And we say, okay, people are generally good. Yeah, there's some bad apples out there. People are generally good, and all we need is a couple tweaks or whatever. And so the Bible would come against that a little bit, and it would say two things at the same time. Its theology of humankind is we are made in the image of God. So that's beautiful, that's good, we reflect. But we're also sinful and what theologians call depraved. We are narcissists. We make decisions for ourselves. And so the Bible says, in a sense, in Romans 3, it says there's no one who's good. So what it means by that is not that there's no one nice. It just means good in the ultimate definition of the word. Like there's no one who could go to heaven without the sacrifice of Jesus. So in that sense, there's no good people in that. But I understand what the question is asking. Generally speaking, and a tragedy happens in their life. It's partly because the fall tells this story. If you go back to Genesis 3, humankind, God said, I want you to do life like this. There's a tree, don't touch it, don't eat from it. He didn't actually say don't touch it, he said don't eat from it. They go there, Satan comes out, goes, hey, and whatever you think about that, whatever. The point of the story is, hey, God never told you you can't do this, so just do it. And if you do it, the reason he told you not to is because you're going to know between good and evil. You're going to be like him. And basically, we did it. And when we sinned together collectively as humankind, the world became broken. That's the story that the Bible tells about the plight. What's wrong with the world? Why are there car crashes? Why is there decay? Why is there evil? Why is there suffering? And so the question becomes, okay, humankind has free will to carry on and do what it does because God wanted love. He calculated the cost-benefit ratio of creation being what it was, gave people free will, and as Dallas Willard pointed out, if God collectively gave humankind free will to do what they wanted, not force them to do things all the time, then what do you get? Dallas Willard said, well, you would get a world very much that looks like ours, which is precisely what we have. And so the beautiful thing about Christianity is that it doesn't come down and answer every single time something bad happens to you. It doesn't say, well, here's what God's purpose then is. We know because the cross that it will have a purpose for good. All things work together for good for those who love God. We can't necessarily see that in this life. In the end, there's going to be an understanding in the new heaven and the new earth that Jesus actually reverses evil. That's why he came. He died on a cross. So Christianity doesn't answer every single why did this, why did this, why did this. But what it does say is it's not that God doesn't care. And we know that God cares because historically, he actually entered into the pain in the person of Jesus historically and actually took on evil and absorbed it himself. So, and Christianity is not the only worldview that has to answer. Every worldview has to answer this question. Atheism has a terrible answer to this question. Eastern mysticism, all of these, they're not, Christianity is the best idea in regard to answering this question.
So what would you say to someone who is like on the receiving end almost of like suffering or evil and is going through that right now, and it's like it's something nice to hear, and like we have free will, but someone who's actually going through the pain of it, the tendencies, I want to blame God, or I want to what do you do with that?
Well, the first thing for the skeptic, I would say, even philosophically, going through that, the fact that you feel that is evidence for the existence of God. If you didn't have that feeling of injustice, or you wouldn't have any, as C.S. Lewis talked about, every time I tried to put God on trial for the way the universe was, I had to always check myself, because where did I get the idea of what the universe should be like anyway? And so I had this moral category called suffering, but where did I get it? If I was just an animal, I wouldn't have it. Somebody had to give this to me to say, I'm suffering right now. This is an evil. So the first thing is to say, when you're going through it, just know it's actually an evidence for the existence of God, not away from him, as atheism would say. But the beautiful thing about the gospel is it's a balm to our soul in so many ways, because it says that Jesus entered into the pain. I talked about this in the sermon a couple weeks ago. John chapter 11, Jesus wept, shortest verse in the Bible. Why does he weep? His friend died. He weeps because, even though he's going to raise him from the dead in 10 minutes, he weeps because Jesus enters into our pain. He's the God who comes down alongside of us. And the image I gave in the sermon is when you're detoxing and you're sitting in a room and you're puking and you're shaking and you're trying to come off drugs, Jesus is the God who doesn't just send a book down and go, do this stuff.
Right.
He's the shepherd who enters in. He's gentle and lowly. He sits on the floor with you, loves you back to health. This is the version of God that you get in Christianity. You don't get that in any other idea in the marketplace of ideas.
I'm going to cut you off there because you're out of time. But if you want to read more, you should actually read this book because that answers a lot of the questions. Okay, we only have time for a couple more questions. Okay. So this is a fun one that just came in. 30 seconds. What's your favorite movie? Which is funny because you think, so he often says like all these critiques about movies, and you say things about, oh, this movie's good, this movie's bad.
Right.
You have a lot of opinions. And I remember when I first met you like years ago, you said to watch this movie. I won't say what it is, but we watched it and it was awful. Like, awful.
Yeah, but awful in what way, Kristen?
Oh, like it was
not
like...
the art of it was brilliant.
Okay,
it was an awful experience because it was painful.
Right, I got all my friends together, we watched it, and we're like, your
Kristen,
movie critique just kind of went down in my book.
Anyways.
Okay, 30 seconds.
Yeah. So, I got to think like, Shawshank Redemption, Godfather 1, Godfather 2, Jaws is in the top 10. Schindler's List is maybe the greatest film ever made.
Okay.
So again, whether this stuff's like, oh yeah, let's get the family together, watch Schindler's List. No.
Probably not, yeah.
But that's the greatest stuff.
Okay, there you go. There's your answer to that one.
Yeah.
Okay, one more question. What's the best piece of advice you've ever been given? It's a good one to end it off.
Oh, that would be. Oh man, there's so many from like a leadership perspective.
I don't know. There's no specific.
Here's the thing. I had when I was 19 and became a Christian, got into church, started preaching that sermon, and then a bunch of people said, "You should go and do this for a living. You yelled at us really good." I was like, "Oh, cool." So I went to Bible college, and the first year, I saw this professor from off in the distance, and I said, "Man, I want this guy to mentor me." And so year 2, I got up the nerve to ask him, and he said, "Yeah, I don't know if I call it mentorship, but I'll be your friend." And I remember him and I, for the rest of the 4 years I was there, he poured into me and changed my life in so many ways that I can't count. He's the reason I'm sitting here doing this right now. But his main thing was, you got to get to Jesus. You got to know Jesus from the text. Let that define your life. Like, I'm sitting there, at restaurants at 1 a.m, processing, I'm at his office by 6 a.m. going, poured into me, started getting me to teach lectures and blah, blah. Anyway, point being, there's a lot of things I could talk about. I could talk about advice with marriage. I could talk about, but my point is, there's this Chaim Potok, who's one of my favorite authors. He's a Jewish author. He writes all these fantastic novels. And in one of his novels, he was talking about, what does the Talmud teach? He says that in life, you need to choose a teacher and choose a friend. That you need those two things in your life. And I would say that for me, I got a teacher, someone to mentor me, to shape me. I came under them. I listened to what they said and didn't think I was smarter than them. And I think this generation, our generation, Kristen, is it's losing itself a bit because they think they know stuff. I don't know if it's because of the internet, whatever. You don't know stuff. You don't even know what you don't know. And there's a humility of spirit that you need to get, because you approach things at times and you think you think you're smarter than you are, you think you're ahead of the game. You need to submit yourself under someone who can pour into your life, because in 10, 20 years from now, that is going to be what shapes you. It shapes my marriage, it shapes my job. Taking that yoke, like they used to talk about, when Jesus says, "My yoke is easy, my burden is light," that's because rabbis would give you, you would take on the yoke of a rabbi. And everyone was doing it in the first century. So I did it in the early days, and it changed my life. It changed the direction of my life. And I just think there's people out there who aren't doing it. And these 50-year-old people, these 60, I'm talking to the 20 or 30-year-olds now, these 50, 60, 70-year-old people, they know stuff. They've been through life. Sit under them, learn from them. They will change the direction of your life. So anyway, that's pretty specific, but it was one idea that popped into my head.
Why did God bother to create, knowing how messed up creation would get?
Yeah, it's a great question. On the one hand, we don't know the answer to that because it's hard to know always the mind of God. There's only so many things that you have: general revelation, which is creation. You have special revelation, which is the Bible. And there's also only so many things the Bible pulls the veil back on and says, here's what the motivation for God was. And so sometimes, like, even if you look at the question of evil, it's oftentimes we're philosophizing about where evil came from. But what's interesting about the Bible is it never tries to answer the question of where evil came from. For instance, Job, which is like the great book about the question of evil from the beginning to the end, you never get like the answer, where did evil, where was its origin? You get, hey, look, Job, you're not actually smart enough to figure all this out, which is what the ancient philosophers said about evil and suffering. You read like pagan, non-Christian, non-religious, the philosophers at the time, 2,000 years ago, they would look at the pain and suffering, which they saw more of than probably we do in some sense, because the world was a pretty rough place. And they didn't say, ergo, God doesn't exist. They said, ergo, I don't have the brain capacity to figure out why the gods would allow all the things that are happening. Post-Enlightenment, we think reason is the main thing, so we think we should be able to figure it out. The reality is there's things God does that we don't necessarily understand. Alvin Plantinga philosophically talks about this as the no-see-em problem, where if you go into a tent and there's these bugs called no-see-ems. They're so small you don't see them. If you go into a tent and you open up the tent and you're looking for a Saint Bernard dog, and you go, you don't see it, you go, oh, there's no dog here. But you can't do that if you open up the tent and go, there's no seams in here because you can't see them. In the same way, Plantinga says, why would we say, well, because we see evil, God doesn't exist. It's like maybe things happen that we can't necessarily always understand. We don't see them, but we can't deduce, ergo God doesn't exist. And so we don't know the reason or the rationale behind why God did everything they did. I think part of why if we believe the Bible, that the cross of Jesus Christ, God himself, the second person of the Trinity, becoming a human being and dying on a cross and rising from death is the greatest moment of glory the universe has ever seen, then sin serves that purpose in the end. And so this is why the Bible says, whatever happens, God can take it and use it for a good. So whether that's Joseph gets chucked down the well, by his brothers and left for dead, and he ends up rising to power. This is the Genesis story in Egypt and becoming like the second guy in command, so that years later when his brothers are dying of a famine, they come to him and he actually feeds them, because what you meant for evil, God meant for good. And so there's a sense in which God is doing an amazing thing. Throughout the Bible doesn't stop and go, or even in our life, when a bad thing happens, it's not that Christianity says, here's why every single time. But it certainly says we know that God cares. The answer is not that God doesn't care about the pain and suffering in the world. He does care. We know he does, because he came in the person of Jesus and actually dealt with it. Why he created, there was a choice he had when he was creating. He knew the risk that people would, the serpent in the garden, humankind taking the fruit. Hey, you're going to know good and evil. You're going to be like God, or don't do it and listen to God and obey. What's beautiful about that picture, as I heard one theologian talk about, a lot of people say, well, if he knew that Adam and Eve, and this is similar to the question, were going to sin, why did he create the tree? Why not just not create the tree? The tree of the knowledge of good and evil, the tree of the option. And what the one writer said is, because if you have the tree and humankind never eats of the fruit, what you have in that moment is you have obedience to God without sin. See, right now, you and I can be obedient to God in the sense of there's sin, and now I'm going to be obedient to God and not. But if you have the option of sin and you don't have people take it, you still have the beautiful reality of obedience, but you don't have sin in the world, because sin hasn't entered in through the original sin, the fall of mankind. So anyways, all that to say, God knew there was this cost-benefit ratio. He, sketched it out and said it's worth the risk. He created humankind with free will, knowing that that's where love comes from. If he created robots, that's not love. There was free will, and as Dallas Willard talks about, if you give humankind free will, you're going to get a similar world to the one we actually have, which is a lot of painful things that actually take place that God is overseeing sovereignly.
Can you talk to us just a bit about, the question is messed up, like how messed up creation would get, but then you think about like the Noah story, like how he just wiped out the whole earth, and then why doesn't he do that again? Right.
Well, let me flip it, because I agree the world's messed up, it's broken, and God has done something about it in Jesus. But there's also a different question that philosophers ask, which is, forget the problem of evil for a second, or the problem of things brokenness. What about the problem of good? Meaning, why is, we don't know whether God is holding back 99.9% of the evil that could be taking place right now in the world. What about the problem of how good life is? Like, we're breathing air, we're drinking coffee, we have love in our life, we recognize beauty, we have all these, like, life could be way worse. Why isn't it worse? So that's where we kind of got to stop ourselves a little bit and say, let's not assume this or assume that.
Perspective.
Yeah.
I like that. Okay, next question. Should Christians be careful about the mark of the beast during times like we are in now? Could it be connected to COVID?
COVID and mark of the beast. Yep. Okay.
Yep. We're
going to take a break. No. Okay. So I talked about COVID in the last thing and the end times and so on, and so I won't talk too much about that. But let's just talk about the mark of the beast for a second, and then I can try to maybe connect. So what people forget is you have to have a historical perspective on these things. So yes, we all think we're living in the end times, and the mark of the beast is something that they're going to put under our skin, in our forehead, so we can buy groceries at the store, and they're going to scan your head and give you some watermelons or whatever. And so and it's going to be this vaccine or that, whatever. We come up with these elaborate theories, and then we read them back into the Bible as if that's what the Bible's about. None of that is what the Bible's about. And the reason we know that is because it couldn't have meant something. This is a basic hermeneutical principle, and hermeneutics is the art and science of biblical interpretation. It can't mean something that it couldn't have meant to the original audience. And so he's writing to Christians in the first century in the Roman Empire who were under Nero's persecution, and he starts talking about the mark of the beast being the number of a man. So it's not a concept; it's a man on the right hand of the forehead, 666, and scholars tell us that was basically a way of spelling out, because everything in the book of Revelation, it's an apocalyptic genre, everything is symbolic. There's nothing in it that's literal in the sense of when he says 7 churches, 7 was a number, 12 times 1,000. All of these things have symbolic meaning to them in the book of Revelation. And when he writes 666, it's the number of a man, and scholars tell us it's probably kind of a subtle, hidden way of talking about Nero's persecution, and that if you follow the ways of the empire, you are going to give your life to Caesar, and you're going to worship Caesar as Lord. See, in that century, Caesar was Lord, Savior, Son of God, bringing Pax Romana, peace, all the things that Christianity was subverting and claiming about Jesus, they were claiming about Caesar. So they were living their life in such a way that you couldn't do commerce and business unless you pinched incense to Caesar and gave Caesar your worship. Your right hand, your action, your business, and your thinking had to belong to Caesar. And so that was the way of life. The book of Revelation is written saying you have a choice to make. You can either be somebody who gives their life to Caesar, you're a person of the beast. First century apocalyptic literature, the beast always represented empires. There's a teacher that teaches at TED Divinity School in Chicago that when you come in and take his class in Revelation, he gets you to read 400 pages of apocalyptic literature that's not biblical. It was just a genre of stuff at the time that had all these stock images in it. Beasts were always empires, numbers are always symbolic. So by the time you read the book of Revelation, you're like, it's totally normal. So here's a group of people. You're either going to give your allegiance in your mind and your actions to Caesar or to Jesus, either to the beast or to the lamb. That's the definitive paradigmatic question of the whole book of Revelation. And so here's what that means. It doesn't mean I'm going to put a little chip under my hand. And it actually means something far scarier in a sense, because it's the question of there are people living here today who don't have any chip under their hand or in their forehead, who have already maybe taken the mark of the beast, but they're busy looking for a microchip. You could already be living the way of the empires of the world rather than the empire of Jesus, and you don't even know who is your allegiance to, the worldly system or the system of the Lamb who was slain. That's the question of the mark of the beast. It's not about grocery stores and computer systems in your brain. That's a distraction from the reality of the question. People have been taking the mark of the beast for 2,000 years, and they're taking it today, not in the sense of a microchip, but in the sense of a way of life and thinking and allegiance and heart to the systems of the world versus the system that Jesus laid down, the kingdom of God versus the kingdom of the world that we live in. So I think that's the question people have to have in their heart and mind when they try to answer this question.
I think that's like a lot of good context, because when we read books like Revelation, it's like there's all these weird language of mark of the beast and random like people and whatnot. So
well, that's a random person.
Antichrist. How would you say to someone watching this, how do you approach books like that in the Bible? Like, what is a practical way you can read it, kind of try to understand like end times and whatever that's going to look like, and try to understand this book?
Well, like I said, we've tied to the coronavirus because I think that's legitimate. I think coronavirus is maybe in a sense part of the end times in the same way the pestilence has been part of the end times since the first year the church was birthed in Acts chapter 2, where Peter got up and quoted Joel chapter 2 and said that the sun is going to fall from the sky and the stars and the moon's going to melt, all this stuff. And this is happening in your hearing. This is happening now. For 2,000 years in that sense, it's been the end time. So whether coronavirus is part of it, but again, from a historical perspective, as we talked about in one of the services, you would have thought that when, the Spanish flu was killing 40 million people in 1918, you would have thought that in World War I, when tens of millions of people died, World War II. Now we're in this historical moment. We're in our houses for 3 months and a certain amount of people died. It's terrible. It's horrible. Part of the whole broken system of the world, but I'm not sure it's okay, now it's the end times. Mm-hmm. It feels that way because we're all on our computers, sitting in our houses, taking every idea, going, oh my goodness. Jesus could come back today, by the time we're done this session, or he could come back in 200,000 years. The point is to be ready, to be working under him, and trying to figure out where your heart actually has allegiance. Is it to Jesus or the things of the world?
That's good. Okay, we keep going. How do we know the Bible isn't just made up by people?
Well, come back to the way you, because I didn't really answer your question, the way you hit it when you were doing the follow-up about and connection.
Yeah.
How do you read the Bible properly and get the most out of it was kind of how you were going with that last part of the question. So you got to study the Bible itself. Get yourself a study Bible. NIV study Bible, ESV study Bible is one of the better ones. It gives you introductions to the genre of book that you're reading, to the testament it's in, and then it has commentary all the way down. So you're reading, Paul goes, hey, you're going to be saved by childbearing. You're like, what does that mean, right? And then you look down, you're like, oh, in that century, childbearing, there was a, goddess of this and blah, blah. So it gives you context to help you understand what the Bible's actually about. But how do we know that it's not just made up?
By people.
There's a ton of historical data that jives together with what's written in the Bible, whether that's Old Testament. And you could go on, there's the British museums and the museums respect the Old and New Testament histories because they go in these documents. They tend to be the most trusted documents in antiquity because people look at them and go, these crazy claims that they make. There are so many opportunities to prove the Bible wrong because it claims crazy amounts of stuff. This Quirinius was the governor of Syria and blah, blah. Like you read the opening of the Christmas story in Luke's gospel, you're bored because he spends the first bunch of verses talking about who's in charge of what territories. And everyone looks and they go, yeah, that's actually who was in charge then. That's crazy. And then the example I give in the Problem of God where I talk about this is there was professors for years that said there was no pool. John chapter 5 says there was a pool of Siloam in a place and it had, certain pillars and whatever. And then nobody could find it. So everyone said, oh, your Bible's not real. And then years later, archaeological digs found it exactly as John describes. So over and over and over again, the Bible's vindicated out from history. And there's people, whether it's archaeology or historians that look in and go, these claims they make, they're actually quite legitimate. Whether it's people ruling or wars that took place or territories or geography, kind of crazy, especially with the New Testament. You have people who are fascinated by the idea. So Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, these guys who write the four Gospels, they're fishermen. They're the guys who, as one writer says, kind of failed out of rabbi school. Like you would have to be the best of the best. And if you weren't the best of the best in your mind, like you couldn't memorize Genesis to 2 Kings by the time you were 12 years old, you would go be a fisherman. So Jesus goes and grabs the guys who failed and goes, hey, come on, if you failed seminary, perfect, I can use you. And so they start traveling around doing stuff. And their descriptions of Galilee and this sea and how this mountain comes up, it's all geographically legitimate. And one writer has pointed out, I think it was Richard Bauckham in his book, Jesus and the Eyewitnesses, that it would actually, when people go, well, wait a minute, that he talks about how they're topographically talking about something from the perspective of a first century fisherman. Which is fascinating. They're not talking about it from like a topographical, I am a professor of geology. They're actually talking about it as a first century fisherman would map out the area from Galilee and Samaria, Nazareth, and all these things. It's fascinating. Lots of books written about that. But anyway, that's why it has legitimacy from a historical perspective.
I think that's so good because like you, obviously your job, your focus is everything about studying about the Bible. Practical question for people listening is like there's the whole line of like I feel like there's people in the church who read the Bible but as you're kind of hopefully who don't fully understand I guess like the history and all the little layers of everything. But then on the other hand is you who dedicate your life to reading this. What's like an average person who is trying to pursue Christianity, trying to also run a business, like what are some practical pieces of advice that you could give?
Read your Bible every day. As Augustine said, it's the face of God for us now. You're going to find God in it. Get a study Bible. That's going to be the best way. I mean, there's commentaries on every book in the Bible more than you could ever get through in your life. Yeah, so there's a lot of questions that can be answered pretty quickly by picking up a commentary and going, oh, that's why he said that. Okay. Your study Bible is going to include a lot of that. There's articles at the back of those study Bibles that are great. At the beginning, there's a ton of great information in those things. And it just helps you as a regular person living your life trying to follow the Bible to give you insight into the meaning behind the text. Because sometimes you don't understand why it said this or why it said that, and it has to do with, it's because it's that genre, or he's already written a book previously. It's like when you're reading 1 Corinthians, so often he's picking up answers to questions that we don't have the original question about. And it's because there was a letter exchange, but we don't have the letter from the church to him. So he keeps quoting. So it's confusing because you're like, well, now he's saying it. And then you get your study Bible out. They go, this was actually a question that the Corinthian people asked him, and he's responding to it and so on. So it just helps you with a bit more of the background.
And I really appreciate, how you really encourage us to pursue our own personal faith, or really not just take what you have to say, or leaders in the church, but really dig for ourselves to figure out our own, how we can.
Yeah, I mean, that's the beautiful part of the Protestant Reformation is, in the 1500s and the 1600s, people were like, well, the church is just telling us what to do. The people in power are the only ones who have a Bible, and they're the only ones who have any kind of education. Right. And the Protestant Reformation was putting the Bible back into the hands of the cobblers and the regular people, and saying, read the Bible yourself devotionally, find Jesus in it, try to figure out. And of course, there's tensions in that, because now the cobbler picks up the book of Revelation and goes, I think it means this, and it's like, whoa, no, that's not what I think. So there's tensions in that. Yeah. But the beautiful part about it is, yes, you get a Bible as an individual now, so go read it and meet God yourself in it. And
that was Martin Luther. You could be in any vocation, anywhere. I could be a mom, I could be a shoemaker, it could be anything, and we should all be pursuing this way of living.
Yeah.
Okay, let's keep going. Can a divorced Christian remarry?
Yeah, there's a lot of debate about this in the church. I mean, here's the thing. Jesus teaches a pretty high marriage ethic, which would have actually blown away people at the time. So the Jewish teachers at the time were saying men were kind of trading their wives out pretty easy. Like, she ticked me off one day, divorce, And Jesus comes along in the Sermon on the Mount. He says, you've read in Moses that you can divorce. But I say to you, there's kind of only one or two reasons why you could legitimately get a divorce. Cheating, like someone commits adultery on you. And in that case, there's debate about this. He says you can divorce, and then you won't be committing, if you divorce someone without adultery or some kind of whether they, let's say they abandon you, they divorce you, they die, they cheat on you, those kind of things are reasons, I believe, you can then be freed up to remarry. That's been a debate through history, because Jesus says if you don't have one of those four reasons and you go on to remarry someone, he says it's adultery. That's what he says in the Sermon on the Mount. So that's in Matthew 19. So the question is, if you're freed up for one of those reasons, I think you're freed up to remarry again. Some people say, well, the issue is the remarriage. That's what creates the adultery. And so I would say, if you're in the scenario where you did get divorced for not these reasons, and you remarried, that you're saying, oh my goodness, and now I'm under the banner of adultery. No, it's not the unforgivable thing that's like, for the rest of your life, this is now the scarlet letter on you. It's like, okay, this was a thing, and now you've, said, okay, Jesus, you're in my life, and I'm carrying on forward. You don't want to go back and make, two mistakes, are going to wash this out and make it good again. And so I think the Bible frees up Christians to be able to remarry when the divorce is legitimate, without, as Jesus said, with committing adultery and so on. And 1 Corinthians 7 is a point where Paul actually says they're freed up. And I think freed up means to marry again. So
why can't we just accept Jesus as a moral teacher? Why do we have to believe he was God?
You can't accept him as a moral teacher because his morals were that he was God. So you can't just say Jesus was a great prophet and a teacher, as many people have in other religions and other, and the Canadians love that. I like Jesus as a paradigm, Christus exemplar, it's called, a paradigm of sacrifice. He's the great archetype of laying down your life for your friends. He had really good teachings about the golden rule, but I don't want to accept his teaching on, other stuff. Well, you can't. I remember listening to a New Age philosopher, a really famous guy named Deepak Chopra. He was on Larry King years ago, and he's like, look, I'll take Jesus as a good teacher, but all that stuff about hell and all that. And then he goes, you have to look at the Sermon on the Mount as the high standard of Jesus' moral teachings. That's the document. That's the stuff, Matthew 5-7. Go read Matthew 5-7. it's literally full of teachings on hell. So what Deepak Chopra has done is he's chosen to select what part of the Sermon on the Mount is the pinnacle and what isn't. It's full of questions about hell. It's Jesus saying, I'm more than the Torah, I'm more than Moses, blah, blah. So Jesus' moral teachings were literally about him being God, whether it was through action, where he symbolically said it, or through his words, where he said, literally, I and the Father are one, and there's 50 different statements that any Jew, when you read the text, they're like, making himself out to be God, they realized he was blaspheming and tried to kill him. Over and over and over, the good moral teachings pointed people to the fact that he was God. So you literally can't take him as a good moral teacher, but not receive him as God and the only way to heaven and the one who introduced the concept of hell. All of these things are all part of the whole corpus of his teaching. So you kind of got to either throw him out altogether or receive everything he's saying together as one, and then you make the decision, am I going to follow Jesus or not? But based on the whole thing, it can't be Jesus is my homeboy, but I don't like these parts of what he says, so I'm going to leave that because it doesn't fit my 21st century, a model of things in this particular. Because we've got to be so careful. We've talked about this at all three of these. Be so careful not to make your doubts or your skepticism about Christianity based on your cultural moment, because you're living in 2020 in Canada, and letting that inform your doubts. Be very careful with that, because you're just showing yourself to be a product of your cultural moment, reading the prompter and reading the skepticism that the culture is telling you to have, where if you went to another culture right now, you would find they have different questions. And if you rewind the clock 200 years, there's a whole other set of struggles. So which one are you? We got to constantly be critical of our own critique, doubt our own doubts, and recognize what's the reason behind the reason. There's always a reason. If I doubt Christianity, it's always from a place of faith, right? Some people go, well, I don't have faith. No, you do. The reason you disbelieve in Christianity belief X is because you already believe in non-Christianity belief Y. And so you've said, I already believe this. I already believe miracles don't happen. Ergo, Jesus never rose from the dead. No, you gotta switch that up. You gotta understand you are already in a world of a faith position, whether you recognize it or not. And the illustration I give of that in the book was in a hospital. It was very clear in the secularized culture that we live in. What was very clear was you can't bring your faith to bear on any decision you make. No religious decisions are going to be made in this hospital. And so there was a guy on life support, and there was a question, do we pull the plug? And then they did, and the nurses were all sitting around after, and they said, well, at least he's not suffering anymore. And the nurse thought to herself, that's a religious statement. That is what is called metaphysics, because you don't know. How do they know that that person's not suffering more right now? Saying someone is not suffering after you pull the plug means you have a faith position. That's a metaphysical faith statement. He's not suffering anymore. How do you know this? On what data? What evidence do you have? Oh, none. I just sit around the water cooler and make up stuff as I eat dinner and come up with a philosophy. But you have no evidence for it. It's a faith position. So at least you acknowledge that and you start being critical of your own faith position and not just cracking eggs. You have to be able to answer the question, origins, meaning, morality, destiny, and realize you can't just go around breaking religion and breaking Christianity. You need some beliefs to hold on to yourself.
I honestly love this conversation because I think we're a product of people and thinkers and historians before us. And when you say we're all skeptical right now, we're in a culture that is very skeptical. And I was reading recently about the masters of suspicion who were like Friedrich Nietzsche and Karl Marx and Sigmund Freud, and how they're all like, there is no God. And then we just accept that fact that there's no God, and we don't really think about the repercussions that have come of that. So if there's no God, then you really put the idea that you are God onto yourself. And I picture this this sea. You're in a boat. You're driving a boat, and you can't see anything because it's pitch black. But you put this pressure on yourself that you are God, and you have to make the decisions. But the problem is you're finite. You don't know everything. You're not all powerful. So you could easily fall off a cliff and die, which I think is another more to go with. That's why we have so much anxiety of I don't know. We have all this pressure on ourselves instead of there's a God that can
absorb it for us. We've become kind of the driver's seat. And then years ago, there was a philosopher who pointed out, he said, modern psychology is great, The problem is if it takes away the category called sin, then humankind has no category to explain its brokenness and its plight, and it puts a burden and a weight on itself that leads to nothing but depression.
Right, yeah. So I think, I love this conversation, trying to figure out for yourself instead of just taking on other people's thoughts. How do I become a Christian? What does it mean? And how do I do it? What changes in my life?
What changes?
Okay,
so it's a great question. So what changes in your life is, here's what's really important. Religion is going to tell you the way you can connect to God is by doing a list of things. And basically what that is you earning it. You can climb up the mountain and impress God. You can do pilgrimages. You can do certain prayers. You can do this, you can do this, you can give money, you can help the poor. And that's what God is going to go, oh my goodness, look at how good this person is, I will let them into heaven. That's what religion tells you, and many of you believe in that. The gospel comes along and says, no, you were utterly hopeless to be able to impress God, so God had to come down and do the work for you. He came down the mountain, you could never get up the mountain. He came down the mountain for you in the person of the work of Jesus, died on a cross for your sin, rose again from death historically, not just like in your heart, like actually literally happened to give you new life. And religion will crush you. The gospel will set you free. And so what does the gospel demand of us? Well, in a sense, you end up being changed not by what you do, but by what you want to do. What you want to do is the thing that is most powerful about you. Your pleasure is the reason you make every decision you make in life. That's the thing that has to be changed. Religion is, I will try to do good, and I'll just beat myself into submission. The gospel actually changes you from the inside. It changes your heart. It changes your affections. It changes what you want to do, what you value. And so you think about a marriage. It's not good to just do what your spouse, oh, I know this is going to make her happy. I'll just do this. You got to pray and go, make me love to make her happy. Make me love the things that are going to make him happy. What is the things that I need a heart change? That's what's going to, and that's what the Holy Spirit does through the power of the gospel, through the power of Jesus. So you become a Christian by recognizing that you're made in the image of God, you're sinful, that there was a story through Abraham and Israel that God was trying to deal with the sin of the world through temple sacrifice, and then the person of Jesus came and fulfilled that for you so that you didn't have to earn it yourself, died on a cross, took the wrath of God on himself for you, died as an atonement for sin so that gap could be closed between you and God, rose again from death. And then the rest of the gospel is, okay, Jesus is king, he's reigning, he's ruling, he's brought a kingdom. Now what are you going to do? You need to, one, repent of sin. This is what Jesus says in Mark chapter 1. Repent, for the kingdom of God is at hand. What does repent mean? Turn around from the way that you think, the way that you love, the things that you do. 180, turn from those things, confess to God that you're a sinful person who could never earn his favor. And then secondly, he says, repent and believe. So you repent, you turn from that life, and then you believe in Jesus. The only way you're ever going to change your life or stay a Christian is not by running away from things, right? When I was a kid growing up, my parents sent me to summer camp, and they used to scare us by talking about hell. Right? It's like, they're hanging kids like this going, hell, hell. And they're like, they got the flames going on Friday night. It was called turn or burn night. They'd run you really tired and then go, okay, everybody believe in hell. Do you want to go to the flames? And like counselors are coming to Christ. Everyone's rededicating their life and whatever, because you're tired and you're scared. That will never hold because you're running from something rather than running towards something. And so what you got to run toward is the beauty of God himself. The great gift of the gospel is you get God. It's not that you get to go see your grandma again and eat great food in heaven one day. It's you get God. You get the giver. And he's going to bring you all the joy in life that you'd ever need. And so you repent and you believe in him, and believing in him means, yes, initially you literally pray and come to Christ, confess sin, say, Jesus, I want to invite you into my life. Holy Spirit, I invite you. Thank you for your death. Romans 10 talks about the idea of those who confess with their mouth that Jesus Christ is Lord and believe in their heart that God raised him from the dead shall be saved. That's what the Bible gives you. But then the belief in the Greek, it's an ongoing belief. It's not just I said a magical mantra. I mean, why would Christianity tell everybody to say some magic words at a summer camp? One time I went forward and that's it. No, it's ongoing belief. Every day when your feet hit the floor, I choose allegiance to Jesus over anything else in my life. And that's belief. And the important thing is you get there, again, like marriage. Any dummy can get married. It's not hard to get married. It's not hard to start something. The question is, what's the last day like? Did you get to the last day of your marriage? Did you do what needed to be done? Just like that, the question is, where are you going to be on your last day? Do you still believe in him? Do you still love him? Do you still value him above every other treasure on earth? That's going to be the question of our life, because that's the place where joy and salvation actually happen. So.
Yeah, and I think it's a beautiful question, because it really is a beautiful journey of understanding and really fully knowing God. And we'll never fully know God until we get out of here and die. But it's an ongoing process, which is a beautiful thing. Just because we have a lot of questions left, let's do something fun and do a little rapid fire just before we end up. Okay, so I'm not going to give you 5 minutes per question. Maybe 30 seconds.
30 seconds to answer. How many we do?
I don't know. However many we get to. Okay, let's see. Hopefully your question gets in here. Mark, what part of the Bible was the hardest for you to wrestle with theologically?
Probably the question of evil and suffering, and why God doesn't just give us a straight up answer about what its place is. So when you read Job, all the friends ask, and they philosophize about why evil exists all the way through the book. And then you get to the end and God shows up and you're like, oh, perfect. Now God's going to give us a diatribe on why evil exists. And then he says, where were you when I made hippos? Where were you when I made snowflakes? Basically, I'll do my job, you do yours. And that's the end of the book of Job. And you're like, great. Why? So I would love that a little, meet that out a little.
Okay. Pastor Mark, can we go golfing together?
Yes, as long as you're paying.
What's the best one-sentence explanation for the existence of God?
Oh, gosh. I mean, there's so many. I would say, I don't know, the one that pops out, there's so many places you could go, but I would say everything that begins to exist has to have a cause. The universe began to exist. Ergo, the universe had a cause. It just makes sense of the data.
Cool. But actually, you should actually buy this book. It's his book, Problem of God. Probably recommend it,
Well, thanks, Kristen.
No, definitely go get it. Okay, can God still use me even though I have cerebral palsy?
Yes, of course. Look at the Bible gives you, and this is where in the marketplace of ideas, atheism, I'm telling you, if naturalistic evolution is true and atheism is true, then in a sense, no. Right? Suffering has no purpose. In Eastern mystic philosophy, suffering is just to pay you back from sins you did in a former life. Christianity is the best idea in the marketplace of ideas to deal with your suffering, because it says suffering can be used by God. Look at John chapter 9. Who sinned, this man or his parents? No, neither this man or his parents sinned. This is used for the glory of God. Jesus Christ, Joseph suffered, Job suffered, Jesus Christ suffered. The very center of Christianity is a man suffering, and in that suffering, there's a redemption. And so Christianity is the best because it says you can be used in any capacity that you are for the glory of God in powerful, amazing ways. And you look back through history, look at the people that God uses. It's people who've suffered. Joni Eareckson Tada. Dietrich Bonhoeffer. You just go through the whole, anybody we talk about, anybody we read are people who went through mass amounts of suffering, and God used them to do amazing things.
John
So please,
Calvin,
God, is going to use you to do great things.
Best Father's Day gift you've ever got?
Oh, my wife and children. I got 3 wonderful daughters
Ding, ding,
and
ding,
my
good
wife.
answer.
So every day is Father's Day.
There we go. Perfect answer. Is it wrong to explore spirituality outside of the Bible?
Well, I mean, if you're a Christian, okay, from a skeptical standpoint, that's wrong. It's just the Bible is going to give you the best. The Bible is going to give you the best answers. And most importantly, so Karl Barth, who is this theologian, said this. There's a distinction between the Word. You have the Word, small w, and then you have the capital W word behind the Word. What I want you to do is meet the Word behind the Word, Jesus himself. And the way to do that is through the Word. But this, just relating to this book, this isn't a God. This is God revealing himself, telling us what he thinks, how he feels, how we should live, who he is. Actually, probably more importantly, we focus on it as like, tell me how to live. It's like, you're going to get kind of, you're going to be like, well, when's he going to start talking about how we live? Because so much of this is about him. And we realize even when we listen to sermons, it's like, all right, wrap it up, bro. You've been talking about God for like 30 minutes. What does this have to do with me? It's like, dude, this has nothing to do with you until you figure out what it has to do with God. The gospel is actually about God, and then by implication about you and your life and how you live it. So I would say the Bible is the place where you're going to meet the word behind the word, the God who made you, loves you, died for you, and that's why you should read it first and predominantly, because I looked into all these religions. I was about to jump into another religion before I became a Christian. And I'm telling you, this is the place. Truth and grace are both found in Jesus.
Okay, 2 more questions. Who created God?
Nobody. Everything that begins to exist has to have a cause. So people go, well, who created God? Nobody, because there's no evidence that God ever began to exist.
Okay, one last question. Would you rather be trapped in a room with 10,000 tarantulas for 10 minutes or eat one in 10 minutes? I love it.
How long am I in the room?
10 minutes with 10,000 tarantulas or eat one in 10 minutes. You have 10 minutes to eat one. I
think I got to be in with them. I can't eat one.
Come up with this question?
I can't eat one. I can't even look at them. Spiders are the worst.
I
would take a snake in my bed.
You'd rather be in a room than eat one?
Than eat one?
Yeah.
Eat one raw, like crunch through its fat stomach.
10,000 tarantulas climbing all over.
But as long as I can just do this.
Oh, for 10 minutes?
Well, what would you do?
Definitely eat one.
Gosh.
You're
a psychopath.
Cut it up with a knife and steak and knife.
All right, good. Okay, guys, thank you, Kristen. By the way, send Kristen a lot of messages. She's worked really hard on this, and she's done a great job.
My hair, yeah.
She even got her hair done. And but that's not her phone number, so don't send her asking her out. She's happily married. We love you guys. Thank you for these questions. We hope you'll join us. This is villagechurch.com. That's where you can get all the info about our church. We want to help you, love you, serve you in any way we can. We do this every Sunday, so join us. We'll see you guys next Sunday. Thanks for being part of this.